Well, hello, everybody. Happy Monday. I'm so happy to see you all here, and I'm so happy to add my best buddy in the world. Look, see, I brought him on. See, he's kind of behaving for now, at this moment in time, right now. Anyways, that's hi, that's the Alton Cam. And for now, yay. I hope everybody's doing well. It's courts in session and whatnot. Hopefully I lowered the volume a little bit of the intro music. But if I didn't, let me know. And but I kind of like getting your attention, because if I don't get your attention via the music, I'm gonna get your attention another way, and it's just safer that way. I hope everybody's weekend was good. Same to you. Same to you. The half of the saga of the car ended this weekend when I finally had everything registered and set. So the new car is good. The old car's sitting in my driveway. Yay. Maury, thank you so much for being a member for 3 months. And thank you for being excited for just getting home in time for night court. You have no idea how much that makes me smile. So, oh yeah, that's right. That is right. Sir Elton is nibbling on that toy that I talked about on Friday, where I was like, "What the heck is that?" Right? All I have to do is turn, and his tail is just. He did, and he liked them. Actually, that's not true. He didn't. He tried, and then he said, "Whose are these?" And then he burned them because it's safer that way. Well, I'm sorry. Hopefully you're fine. I think. Hopefully. Speaking of Lisa, apparently Lisa had mentioned something along the lines of a photo that she had taken at one point of a giraffe, and she had talked about this during day court, and she asked if I would show this photo that she was talking about on night court, and I am more than happy to do so, and I will tell you why. Because this is a fantastic picture. It just makes me so happy. It was a picture of this giraffe, and the giraffe is fantastic. So let's see here. Let me share my screen, and ba-da. There it is. Look at that. Look at that good looking. Look at that good looking giraffe. He is just so psyched. He is so happy to be here, or she is so happy to be here. I absolutely love this photo. Lisa, all of your stuff's so fantastic. Yeah. Yay, giraffe. I don't know what kind of face that is, but apparently that's the face the giraffe decided to give every single time that Lisa put the camera up to take a picture. So, yes. You admired the giraffe? Elton? Not John Thomas, surely not. All right, I'll bring him back in a little bit. Apparently, I just can't handle all the connection stuff. While we're here, let's go ahead and say hello to our top 3, shall we? He's not one of them in any way, shape, or form. He just disappears. Hey, Elton, you over there? Oh, there you are. Okay. You're just making a mess or doing something. Can you lay down? Can you lay down? Lay down. Lay down. Oh boy, you didn't ask for all that. Um, he doesn't like to lay down. That's the problem. He wants to always move and whatnot. Yes, return of the doggo. Return of the doggo. I did want to take a couple of seconds and show you all, in case you were wondering, um on Friday we started our 13th Juror trivia night, and so it'll be every Friday, and basically you'll have until Friday until the stream on Wednesday to yeah, the toy is very suspect. It's awkwardly suspect. Um, but Elton didn't come here to act. Um, oh, he's gone. Anyway, so we did quiz night on Friday, and it went pretty well. I think everybody liked it. Everybody seemed to have some good feedback, and so the goal is that every month there will be a winner, and then at the end of the 12 months, we will have a 12-person competition, and then there will be kind of a bigger thing that you can win. Have I decided? Nope, sure haven't. And so basically, what I wanted to do was I wanted to show you again where you can go to get that form to fill it out to then answer the questions and have your points tallied up. And so my goal is for places 1 through 10 each week, I will give you a certain number of points. Okay. And then at the end of the month, we'll tally those points up. So even if you're not first through 10th the first time, you may the second time, everything kind of evens out and balances out, unless somebody's just really flipping good at it. Anyway, so how do you fill out the form? Right. So here's how you do it. You head over to our Elton's still gone. You head over to our link tree and scroll down past Night Court, and you're going to go to Night Court Quiz Party, and that will open up with the quiz entry form. Now, every Friday, you can fast forward to the quiz and enter your YouTube screen name, and then what date the quiz was given, and then enter your questions or your answers here. Now, great idea last Friday, and I will do this from here on out. This on Friday's quiz, you'll have to write in the actual answer. From here on out, I will give each answer a letter, and you can just put the letter on the line. Okay. And that will make it easier for everybody. It'll make it easier for me at the end to score it. So that's what we'll do this Friday. I'm excited to try some of the new stuff with that. And if you ask me what I'm thinking about doing for if you ask me what I'm thinking about doing for quiz night, I have no idea yet. It is I don't know. You did not miss it technically. I haven't given the answers yet, and everybody was pretty good at not putting the answers in the live chat, and I think the live chat's turned off for the replays anyways, at the moment. So you have until Wednesday night, until we start the stream on Wednesday to get your entries in. How do I know? I know because it timestamps your entries and it tells me the date and time. We had somebody that was on Discord earlier saying, I deleted the first response and the second, and because it had my info on the top. Google will automatically sign you in to Google Forms. Now, that being said, you will see the email at the top. I don't collect those. I've set the form not to collect that information. That's not mine to collect. And I did not say I was collecting it, so that's not fair and that's not right. So unlike every other website out there, I'm not collecting those at all. The only time I'd ever collect those is if we were doing some kind of a survey or feedback form, and I wanted to reach back out to you just to get more specifics. But I don't do that for this kind of a thing. There's no need. You can put your YouTube username in there, and that's enough for me. That's all I need. And that's it. Yep. Um. So Google. Believe me, I've got plenty. I've got plenty. It's a matter of I don't want every quiz to just be straight question and answer. I'd love to do some audio quizzes, like play the first 3 or 4 seconds of a song, and you have to figure out what song that is, but every song kind of in that quiz has a shared theme. Um, Something video maybe. I wanna kinda change it up. I wanna make it interesting and fresh. Maybe not every week, obviously, because that's just crazy, but definitely in the coming weeks. I'm gonna turn that down. Am I? Am I not? I'm not gonna turn it down? You don't wanna okay. Okay. Thank you. Elton Elton is hiding under the Elton, come here. Why are you hiding, bud? You don't gotta hide. There's no hiding. There's no hiding in streaming or baseball. And that's a good idea too. Hold on, wait a second. Do you want music trivia? Is good. I also liked. Well, I moved. Everything moved. Guess where the sound bites are from? I really dig that as well. Depending on how hard it is, I might not even give you an option. No, I'll give you options. The questions. Where are the questions? You just have to just scan the YouTube channel. Just use the seek bar, and you'll see when the video comes up for it because I have my own video. I added a video for it. It looks a little bit like this. You never have to watch the whole thing, ever. I love Seek. Why, thank you. These happen to be these are the 2 mascots for the place where yeah, a local local nonprofit, and they have a 5K, and this is a shirt from the 5K. I didn't do the 5K. Come on, really? I should. I should add Elton. I should pay him. Wow, you're getting a good view now. Ooh, that's a really good idea too. Ooh, that requires me to remember. um, yeah, that's a really good idea, Shireen. What I might do is what we can do is get the timestamp for the quiz and get the timestamp for like Chat GPT or whatever that might be. And then we'll put the timestamps in the description and we'll make them a link so you can just click on that, or make them a chapter rather. So you can click on that chapter and it'll go straight to it. I'll figure out how to do that for everybody. So, Ricky. All right, man. Thanks for sticking in there. Thanks for hanging out with us tonight. Name that hot cop. Oh boy. See, all of these things require me. Thank you, Angie. All of these things require me to remember most of it, and it's quite scary because I don't remember anything. You're distracting. So distracting. Dog's so distracting. All right. So I have quite the Night Court Chat GPT story tonight. I decided, and I'm good. I'm good at starting, at least telling you kind of a little bit about what it's about. But it's a romantic comedy with a lot more comedy. This is comedy as defined by ChatGPT. About a relationship between a guy named Gus and a guy named Richard, and we'll just leave it at that. We'll just leave it at that. I could always use a spreadsheet. Always, always, always. No, I'm gonna do a mixture of things. Last Friday reminded me of a couple of things. One, uh, I'm more ethnocentric than I thought. What are you doing? Hey, don't. Oh, you turned it over. What are you playing? Okay. All right. You are distracting, sir. Um, I'm more ethnocentric than I thought because I was asking questions that were centered around the U.S. Well, guess what? Not every one of us is from the U.S. And two, I want to add things from all different kinds of places and times and things like that. So I will be adding. I'll be adding a variety of questions. If we do like a music trivia night, it's going to be music from multiple decades. because I have the analytics on who watches the channel, not your names, but ages and where you're from and things like that. That's just on the back end of YouTube. So I kind of have a good idea. So I just keep it together. I'll just keep it together. I'll make sure there's something for everyone. And Mrs. Bruce Crimes stole Elton from us. So that's why you don't see him anymore. But yeah, and I also like music from all over the place. I like trivia from all over time and stuff like that. So we'll be, Friday, first time I learn lessons. And so we'll go from there. All right. Well, I think it's time to get back in to the trial of Dr. Richard Samuels, because I think we pretty much forgot about Jodi. Everybody forgot about Jodi. I think Eminem should write a parody to "Forgot About Dre," forgot about Jodi. And I love tripod dogs. That's awesome, Julie. Yeah. So it's the trial of Richard Samuels. And as I said on Twitter, at this point I kind of refuse to call him a doctor. It's not that I don't recognize the fact that maybe he got something, but I just don't see it, and I don't think anybody else here does either. So I don't feel bad about it. And yes, there was a vote, and I realized that I was being impulsive with the vote. Not only was it being impulsive with the vote, but then I went straight to, do you want to jump to the end? And somebody had said, actually, I think it was Adam. Adam had said, we've made it this far. We made it this far. And he's right. We've made it this far. And unless something absolutely egregious or stupid happens, I want to kind of push as much as we can. So we're going to keep going. And if things change, if we get to the point where it's just like, hey, no, we can figure that out at that point. I don't want to be impulsive. I don't want to be ADHD all over the place like I typically am. So, all right. Well, I think it's time for a little bit of court. After I put up the logo, a little bit of court.
Okay.
Thank you for 4 months.
And I think that I know that you testified that with regard to that issue of
What's so funny?
Feelings of suicide, right?
She indicated that she had, from the beginning, since this happened and she became aware of what had gone on, she was planning to kill herself.
Right, she was suicidal, right?
Well, in varying intents, it means different things, but her plan was to eventually kill herself.
And, sir, that's not a new thing for her, though, is it?
Is it a new thing?
Right, it's something that she thought of before, right?
She may have thought of it before, but this became an overwhelming thought and plan for her. She never felt that she would be going to trial. She figured somehow she would be taking her life.
And this is something that, again, in order to find this, we would have to find that this wasn't present before the trauma, right?
Well, it doesn't mean that it couldn't have been thought of or verbalized earlier in her life. The fact is that this became a predominant thought in her planning. This was brought up numerous times throughout her interview, and it was related to the time of the crime.
And I didn't ask you that, did I? I asked you whether or not this trauma has to be cannot be present before the trauma. That's one of the requirements of it, right?
Yes.
And it does say persistent, C reads, persistence, avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and numbing of general responsiveness not present before the trauma, right?
Yes.
And in fact, she made statements that she was going to commit suicide in high school, right?
I believe so.
And she also made statements that she was going to commit suicide to Matthew McCartney, right?
Yes.
And she also, in the journals we took a look at, and in fact, one of the questions from the jurors was involving these journals and whether or not it was, in your opinion, whether it was no big deal or negative, if you will, that she was talking about suicide. Do you remember that question from them?
Yes.
And so not only from the teenage years over to Mr. McCartney, but then later on in 2008, is that when it was, 2007, she's talking about suicide, right?
Yes.
Those are 3 separate instances where she's talking about suicide, right?
Yes, but the focus of the reasons why differed.
I understand that the reasons may differ, but the effect is the same. When somebody wants to commit suicide, is they want to kill themselves, right?
Yes.
And you're saying that even though you had all of that before, you're saying that you still found this factor pursuant to your 35 years of experience, because in your judgment, those 3 other ones don't matter. The only one that matters are the ones that come after June 4th of 2008.
All the information is taken into account, but this became an almost obsessional plan for her to do away with herself before a trial.
And you're basing that on the defendant's statements, right?
Well, yes, of course.
And at no time when she was in the jail, was there ever any indication that she was on suicide watch, right?
No, she never had a plan.
Right. In other words, it wasn't there. You didn't find anything like that, right?
No.
So the only thing you really have to point that out to us is her word, right?
Yes.
Did she ever tell you that she undertook any steps to do it?
No, she did not.
Now, we also have another section under that, which is C6. Let's talk about that. And what does C6 refer to, sir?
Restricted range of affect, for example,
Hold on, let me write it down. Is that also something called unable to have loving feelings? Is that what it says?
That's given as an example. E.g.
Well, I'm just writing down what it said. And you found this one too, didn't you?
I did find that, yes.
All right. Tell me what it is that she had that indicated to you that she had a restricted range of affect.
In her conversations with me,
Yeah, Eddie.
she would
Congrats,
frequently
3
not
months.
show the kinds of emotions that we would normally expect to see
Thank you, sir.
when discussing such emotionally charged
agree.
issues as the
Great
topics
people.
that we discussed. That is referred to as blunted affect, or a restricted range of affect.
And that range of emotions could include laughing, right?
It could.
It could include smiling, right?
It could.
It could include giggling, right?
It could.
In fact, it has to do, if you will, with the context and the response from the person in that context,
In a
correct?
particular context, yes.
Right. So for example, you did review her conversations with this detective, didn't you?
Yes.
And in fact, at certain times, she's seen giggling in those interviews, isn't she?
Yes.
So again, that's not a blunted affect, is it?
The tendency to show a blunted affect can be situationally determined. In my conversations with her, for many of the times we would talk about the specifics of the crime, her affect was not connected, was not tied in, did not modulate according to the content that I would expect someone who is involved in this way would react.
And now you're imposing your standard. You're saying the way you would expect somebody to
The way a
react.
professional would expect someone to talk about the death of someone close was not followed through with an emotional response that we would normally expect to see in other clients discussing the same type of situation.
And you're talking about somebody who killed somebody else or somebody who's had a loved one who died.
Correct.
Which one is it? Loved one who died or
Well,
killer talking about their killing?
It doesn't matter because the affect was blunted. And what causes the blunted affect is not pertinent to the diagnosis. What is important is the person's affect, their emotional state, their inability to express a range of emotions that one would consider, that a trained professional would consider to be appropriate for the discussion, the area under discussion.
And you're such trained official, right?
Yes, I am.
mean, expert, right?
Yes.
And one of the other things that you reviewed as part of your investigation into this case is the unredacted interview of the defendant, 48 hours, right?
Yes.
And through it, as she's sitting there, She's smiling, isn't she? When she's talked about certain things, for example, involving Mr. Alexander.
Yes, but that was before she admitted to what actually happened.
Oh, so just because she was lying, it's okay to sort of smile at the lie? Is that what's going on here?
No, I'm not saying she was lying either. I'm saying that she built up a defense mechanism to help her not deal with the emotional trauma of what really happened. She created an alternative universe that she responded to. So it's not surprising that she could smile and laugh about this alternative universe because it didn't actually exist. When talking about Mr. Alexander at a later time with me, she had blunted affect.
With regard to this alternative universe that you're talking about,
We
it's
have
nothing
1
more
hour
than
and
a lie,
20 minutes
right?
thereabouts.
In your words, sir.
No, sir, I'm
this
asking about you. Is it
witness.
true
And then
that
we
two
move on.
individuals, based on everything that you know, is it true that two individuals came in and killed Mr. Alexander? Is that your understanding?
Objection, yes, still.
Is that your understanding?
No, that is not what happened.
Well, it's not your understanding, right? In other words, it's based on what she told you, right? You weren't there.
Well, it's my understanding.
Right. And so what you're saying then is that because at that point she was lying about it, then all this give and take with the reporter isn't indicative of anything other than that she's a better liar.
I wouldn't characterize it as lying necessarily.
Well, what would you characterize the fact that somebody tells an untruth?
It could be a psychological defense mechanism to shield the person from dealing with the reality of what really happened.
I'd
It
like him
could
to
be
put an emphasis on the
Almost
T in
something that would
reality.
occur in a dissociative identity disorder or multiple
gosh.
personality.
But you didn't diagnose her with that.
No, I did not. I rejected that. But nonetheless, it's possible for a person to believe in two realities, react one way to one reality, another way to another reality. I did not
His diction is
ultimately
so
keep
uppity.
that diagnosis.
So there's no need to talk about that diagnosis since you didn't keep it, right?
I was using it as an example.
Right, but it doesn't apply here, does it?
No, it does not.
So let's not talk about things that don't apply. Can we agree to that?
Sure.
So in this particular case, what we're talking about is a situation that you've reviewed all of these hours of conversations of her with the 48 Hours people, and you saw her giggling, you saw her talking, and to you, that doesn't have any significance because later on, when she changed her mind, she did have some sort of reaction, right?
I didn't say it had nothing to do with it. I'm just simply saying that her emotional capabilities were different from those two different versions, those two realities that she created. Well, she created an artificial reality.
How about this, again, this blunted affect? Isn't it true that when she would call, for example, her relatives, isn't it true that she would giggle and she would laugh?
I'm not privy to her conversations with her relatives.
Well, you weren't privy to her conversation with her mother, were you?
No.
But you still talked about it, right?
Yes.
It's because you read about it, right?
Yes.
Well, let's take a look at that.
You know, there's a lot of that in this world these days. He's ahead of the curve. Also totally digging the rugby shirt right there.
You've already admitted to us that in Exhibit 556, this is something that you considered in your evaluation, correct?
Yes.
Well, why don't you take a look at page 478 at the upper top. I've highlighted it for you to see whether or not that refreshes your recollection about whether or not she would laugh when she would call relatives from jail.
Yes, I see that.
And you read this before, right?
Yes.
If I may have it back. That's not a blunted affect to call from jail and laugh and giggle appropriately with a relative, is it?
No.
Objection as to mischaracterizing giggling appropriately. Dr. Samus has no knowledge to that.
The answer will stand.
Can you
And yet
repeat?
still found this C6 factor, didn't you?
Could you repeat that, the last statement you
At
made?
this point, they're
In
just
light of
projecting
everything
to
that
make
we've
it look like
talked
they're doing
about,
something.
you still find the C6 factor because you believe she had a blunted affect, right?
Yes. Dealing with certain issues, her affect was definitely blended.
Let's take a look at number 5.
Just turn me up.
Number 5, What is number 5 to you?
Feeling of detachment or estrangement from others.
What are you talking about there?
I'm talking about the fact that she reported to me often feeling that she was in a state of unreality, that she didn't feel tuned into the reality. She would feel, to use the word, detached from the reality, almost looking at her reality as an observer. She also reported that her thinking was oftentimes foggy and unclear, and that she would not be able to tune in to what was going on around her. This is a characteristic of psychological detachment.
Well, but there's a modifier there, isn't there? From others. Isn't that what it says?
Detachment or estrangement from others, yes.
Right. It's talking about interpersonal relationships, isn't it?
Well, that's part of it, yes.
Well, no, not part of it. Why don't you read the whole thing? And if you want, I'll show.
Feeling of detachment or estrangement from others.
It doesn't say feeling of detachment or estrangement, does it? It says from others, right?
That's correct.
So what others was she feeling detached or estranged from? I don't want to, I'm asking specifically what others she felt estranged or detached from.
She reported feeling different from the other cellmates or other individuals in the jail.
Giggle.
And that was her world at that particular time. So she felt unable to relate to many of them. She also reported feeling this sense of fogginess and this inability to connect with people in the same way that she did beforehand. That's what was reported.
She'd never been in jail before, right?
That's true.
So it's not, in your experience, unusual for somebody who's in jail for the first time to have difficulty relating to others, right?
It's possible, yeah.
Oh, Candace, thank you so much. Y'all, Candace gifted 5 memberships, and they went to Holly, Wendy, Holly Henderson, Barbara Rainbolt, and Laurel Volunteer Fire Department. Well, Laurel Volunteer Fire Department, welcome in. Don't put me out. I like to stay on fire, figuratively, not literally. But thank you all. Welcome to the cult. Grab yourself your Kool-Aid with a C and an E because of copyright infringement, and then grab your jury seat by typing !seat and take it. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Candace. I appreciate you so much. While we have the knucklehead paused, obviously you guys know that I have, the next trial is Joel Guy Jr. and it's a doozy. I'm reading the appeal judgment, which actually has more information in it, in terms of a narrative. And I made it to page 6, the bottom of page 6. And you all will get this because you've been involved with the Jodi trial. But it starts out with officers with the KCSO Forensic Services Unit process the crime scene at the Golden View Lane residence. Officers collected 3 gasoline cans from the garage that were each filled with approximately 15 gallons of liquid believed to be gasoline. So, gas math. I read it, and I let out an audible, and Mrs. Bruce Crime said, "What is wrong?" And I said, "Gas math." And obviously she has no idea what I'm talking about. It made sense. I thought it was funny. He obviously got them from Jodi. That's all I'm saying. I'm so glad you guys get this because nobody outside of this, these 4 walls understand. Oh gosh, it's wild. Anyways, he was about to do a lot of different things. This guy is he's one of the few human beings who has cojones, thinking that he could get away with it, but lacks cojones because he's a whiny man-child. You'll find out if you haven't seen it before. Don't spoil it for yourself.
Yes.
Well, no, you have had 35 years of experience. You know that phenomenon, don't you?
Yes.
And so, in this case, it wouldn't be a stretch, would it, for her to have difficulty dealing or It wouldn't be a stretch for her to have feelings of detachment
I
or
want a
estrangement from the other prisoners, right?
It still meets the criteria.
And that's based on your examination and your 35 years of experience, right?
Correct.
Let's talk about number 4. Did you find this one too?
I beg your pardon, how did you characterize that?
Did you find this one too?
Find that one too? No, I did not.
So this is a no. If we take a look, for example, at exhibit number 544,
It's a good video.
talks that you actually only found
Thanks for doing
C3
that.
and C6, right?
Yes, I indicated that there was an omission typographically.
And what you're saying is that it's somebody else's fault when this report came out, right?
No, it was my fault.
Overruled.
Yes.
No, overruled, the answer was
It
statement.
was my fault. I omitted typing in the number and the letter.
Did you type it yourself or did you have a typist?
Some of it was typed by someone else, some of it I typed myself.
So how do you know who typed this?
Some of it I typed by myself and some was typed by somebody else.
So who
Different sections, some sections I would
Who's the other
dictate
person?
and they were typed by someone else. In some sections, I used my dictation software, and in other sections, I would type it myself and take the pieces and put it together, revise it over and over again, and somewhere I usually take responsibility for the final copy. However, I made an omission.
And with C3, what is that?
Inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma.
Inability to recall an important aspect.
I'm not gonna lie. He's
Of the
taking
trauma, right?
everyone to class. He's
And this is
literally
what you've
doing
been
this for
telling
the
us
jury,
is the amnesia, right?
and I kind of
That
appreciate
would
it.
be, yes, that would be an example of the amnesia.
This is the dissociative amnesia that you've been talking about, right?
Yes.
This is the fog, right?
No, this is the absence of memory.
All right, so this doesn't have anything to do with the fog, even though the fog affected her ability to recall things.
Well, can we go into a discussion of amnesia or?
No, in terms of the fog, did the fog restrict her ability to recall important aspects of the trauma?
In the beginning and the end, yes.
So they did affect her ability to recall important aspects of the trauma, right?
Yes, but the amnesia was responsible for her lack of memory about the bulk of the period of time during which the trauma was occurring.
And this finding, if you will, this
Donna,
that
you
she had an
brought
issue
up
remembering
an
this,
idea for a
there is
sound
no
effect.
scientific test that can be conducted
I'm working on it now.
to determine whether or not a person actually had amnesia, right?
Well, they probably are, but not within the realm of this type of evaluation.
Well, are you saying, for example, that somebody could hook up the defendant up to some sort of machine and that machine could tell us whether or not she actually experienced this loss?
There might be a way of doing that with scanning and electrodes implanted in the brain, but as I said, it's not something that we could use as a practical tool these days.
So these implanted items had to be in at the time of the killing, right?
No, you could test someone probably post-trauma as well. But as I said, what I'm talking about is experimental and not available to us at the time.
So-
So practically speaking, no.
No. All right. So, and there is nothing that we can, for example, look beyond her brain. There's no other area that we can look at to actually get a total assurance that what she is telling us is truthful, right?
Correct.
So we can look, for example, at the journals. We could look at them, right?
Yes, we could.
But again, that's a situation where your expertise would have to come in, right?
Yes.
We can look at, for example, conversations that she may have had with the media, right?
You
Correct.
get
And again,
nothing.
your expertise
You
would have to be
lose.
called in to
Good
determine
day,
whether or
sir.
not she's able to recall this, right?
Correct.
I mean, you indicated that this issue
Thanks, Donna, for
involving this
suggesting it.
PTSD was
Doggone
something
it, you
like
beat me to
a
it.
crater. Do you remember talking about it?
I did.
And that the event was this anxiety, right? The meteor that came in, right?
That's right.
But in that circumstance that we're talking about, the crater, people can actually go look at the crater, can't they?
Yes, that's correct.
Sure. And we can go and we look and we can see that it's big and it's got an indentation in the earth, right?
Correct.
Whereas in this particular case, you can't
place.
look into her brain and find any indentation or any indication like that to show you whether or not she's actually telling the truth about this amnesia, right?
That's the nature of psychology.
I'm not asking you if that's the nature of psychology. I'm asking you about whether or not as you sit there testifying, can you look over there and find such a key inside her brain that physically others could look at, like the crater example?
I can opine with respect to all reasonable psychological probability.
So the answer would be no then, right? You cannot.
I can respond in terms of referring to all psychological probability.
Which is basically telling me that you don't know, right?
I don't think that's what I'm saying.
Well,
could you rephrase that perhaps?
Sure, we're talking about the crater. You indicated to me that somebody could go out to the crater and look at it, right?
Correct.
And that's the PTSD, right?
That would be equivalent to the symptoms being presented for PTSD.
Right. If you look over at the defendant, there is no such crater, and I'm using that metaphorically speaking, there is no such crater there that would allow you to to point it to it and say, see, there's the crater, that's why she had loss of memory, right?
No, psychology is not that type of a science.
And in fact, what that means is that in terms of this issue, whether it's dissociative amnesia, which you've talked to the jury about, other questions or anything else, we're left at the mercy of her words, right?
And other information picked up from the ancillary materials that I reviewed.
The only one where the jury
Right, the
knew that
ancillary
if the
materials being
prosecution
the
was
journals,
crossing,
right?
The journals?
They should
48 hours
stretch
conversations,
first.
right?
Yes.
And text messages, all that sort of stuff, right? But again, you can't point to anything like the crater example, can you?
No, there's a difference between geological science and the science of psychology.
Right, so talk about 2. What does number 2 talk about?
It talks about efforts to avoid activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma.
All right.
Mr. Martinez, we're going to take the noon recess.
Sir, Judge, I'm wondering if we may have the overhead turned on.
Glasses. They fold in half. What are
Sir,
those?
when we left off,
They
we were talking.
extend. I bet you those cost way too much. The folding in half was one thing, but then they extend. Oh, if you didn't see it, just turn towards the television and focus right on those glasses.
Efforts to avoid activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma.
All right.
Mr. Martinez, we're going to take the noon recess.
Wait for it.
Sir, Judge, I'm
Wait
wondering
for
if
it.
we may have the
Fold in half.
overhead turned on.
Open. We got matchsticks and
Sir, when we left off, we were talking about the second, or prong number 2 under the C, factors for
you know who sells
post-traumatic stress
glasses
disorder. Do you
like
remember that?
Yes.
And that's
Gus
not something that
Searcy.
you found, correct?
Number 2, no.
Yep.
And so that
Check,
brings us up
please.
to number 1, correct?
Yes.
You are
And
amnesic.
this section is called persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and the numbing of general responsiveness
Oh, go gadget.
not present before the
Ah,
trauma,
brain.
as indicated by
Can't do
3 or more, correct?
Yes.
And the first one, what does that talk about?
Talks about efforts to avoid
He's the
thoughts,
kind of guy
feelings,
who
or
loses glasses
conversations
when on the top of his
associated
head.
with the trauma.
He doesn't
Okay.
need him to go that
And
small.
you found this one, correct?
I did.
And
Good night.
Don't know.
what efforts did she, according to you, undertake to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma?
I took her original story as an effort or an occurrence that separated her from the realities of the trauma. And by creating this other story, it created a psychological distance between what happened that she was responsible for and what she first claimed happened when she was the victim of this
That's something that does
obviously
happen.
false story about what had
It's
happened on
true.
that day.
So
But
what
not
you're
in this
talking
case.
about under number 1 is a lie.
Not at all.
She told a lie, and based on the fact that she told a lie, that was her effort to avoid feelings, conversations associated with the killing.
I'm not characterizing it as a lie,
You're characterizing it as a story.
as a story, a defense mechanism.
You call it a defense mechanism, but this defense mechanism, as the way these things have come out, based on what you tell us about what was told later, is a story, isn't it?
Yes.
But there are other things that she did during this period of time that affect this. Are you familiar with the fact that she sent 20 irises to Mr. Alexander's grandmother?
I don't remember the number being 20, but I do remember that, yes.
And in fact, if she admitted to that, that's not an effort to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the killing, is it?
It's an effort to distance herself from the reality of the fact that she did the killing.
Online.
And that effort requires
At all.
thinking, doesn't it?
Like, at all.
Yes.
So in her thinking about the 20 irises, she's thinking about the killing, right?
She's thinking of the event and the actions of maintaining normalcy as a result of what had happened, in my opinion, it's very similar to what happens in a dissociative identity disorder, where a whole alternative reality exists. Now, I didn't use that diagnosis here, but as part of her defense mechanism, I believe that she created this alternative reality which insulated her from the pain of dealing with what had happened, that she was responsible for, and carried on as if the alternative reality was the truth.
So bottom line is, she did think about it, right? And that's why she thought about the killing, and that's why she sent the irises, right?
I don't know whether she thought about it. There's no way that I can tell.
Then why else would she send 20 irises unless she was thinking about Mr. Alexander being dead, whether it be by one story or the other?
Well, obviously sending the irises was in response to him being deceased. That's true.
Right. And she knew, according to you, there was one or two realities, right? She knew that either these two people came in and killed him or she killed him, right?
Right.
So she's thinking about the trauma then, right?
Not thinking about the trauma in terms of her being the actor or the person who did the killing.
Right. She's thinking about the trauma in terms of somebody putting the gun to her head, though, right?
That's correct.
So she is then thinking about the trauma, right?
A trauma, right, a trauma.
Right. The trauma that she designated in the PDS, right? Under number 4.
Correct.
The other thing that she did with regard to this is that, isn't it true that she went on national television with a show called 48 Hours, right?
That's true.
She did it on 2 occasions, right?
Yes.
And during those 2 occasions, she talked about her thoughts, her feelings, and had a conversation associated with the killing, right?
Yes.
So now we have 2 examples where she's thinking about the killing, right?
We don't know what she was thinking.
You don't think that when she's asked about Travis Alexander by a correspondent, that she's not thinking about the killing? What could she possibly be thinking about then?
The alternatives to the fact that she killed him.
I'm not, but she's thinking about the trauma. He's dead, right?
She's thinking about the trauma. That's right.
This here just says efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with trauma. It says that, right?
That's right. It says that.
And that comes straight from DSM-4, right?
That's right.
And you said that was the Bible, right?
Absolutely.
And so it doesn't say with regard to the trauma, it doesn't say whether she killed him or not, does it?
It also doesn't say absolutely no thoughts whatsoever. It says efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. These efforts may not always be successful.
And that's not my question. My question here doesn't distinguish the trauma, does it?
No.
Which is the point that you were trying to make to me with regard to the PDS, right? The trauma doesn't matter, right?
In that case, yes.
Yeah, so why does it not matter with the PDS and it does matter here? Aren't you being a bit selective?
I'm not sure I understand the point you're trying to make.
Sure, you do understand the question. The PDS, you told us it doesn't matter what the trauma is, right?
At the time that I scored it, correct.
Well, no, even now you're telling us when you testified that the trauma doesn't matter.
The trauma did not matter. It was her internal perceptions of the emotional reactions to whatever trauma occurred, which is what I measured.
And the trauma doesn't matter is what you said. And so you said you could still use that test and don't have to restore it because the trauma doesn't matter. That's what you said in response to a jury's question, right?
Yes.
So if that analysis applies for the PDS, you're saying, that analysis does not apply to the DSM-4, even though the PDS was used to corroborate the post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
I'm afraid I'm not getting the point.
Sustained.
Sir, you did use the PDS to support or corroborate your finding that this was post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Correct.
And you said with regard to that, the trauma doesn't matter, right?
Yes.
With regard to this, by its own definition, it says effects to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the
doing that.
trauma, right?
Yes.
It doesn't say first or second story, does it?
Vulnerable thing.
No, it doesn't. It talks about the trauma of it being either
Makes me think.
at one point an observer to the killing
He's like,
or
oh,
being the
oh.
actor in the killing.
Right, so when you start trying to make this distinction with me about she doesn't know whether or not she killed him, it's just trauma that we're talking about, whether or not it was her that killed him or somebody else, right?
That's the point I'm making.
So we get back to the 48 hours interview, when you're saying, we
that better?
discussed this, and well, the question was, well, isn't it true that she discussed thoughts, feelings, conversations associated with the trauma in the 48 hours interview?
Yes.
So again, that speaks against what's in number one, doesn't it?
I'm sorry, I don't see it that way.
Right, you wouldn't see that way because you have feelings for the defendant, right?
I beg your pardon, sir.
Jose, the objection.
It's argumentative, totally inappropriate.
We approach, Your Honor.
I'm sorry, I don't see it that way.
Right, you wouldn't see that way because you have feelings for the defendant, right?
I beg your pardon, sir.
Jose, the objection.
It's argumentative, totally
He was not happy
We approach, Your
about
Honor.
that.
You may.
You don't see it that way, right? It's your opinion, right?
Yes, it is.
And
As well
this-
as my professional opinion.
It's your professional opinion based on these 35 years that you've been telling us about, right?
That's correct.
So one of the other things that we know in this case is that the defendant spoke with Leslie Udy. You're familiar with that, right?
Could you refresh my memory?
Sure.
Mr. Udy?
Objection to the on scope.
Approach, please.
So we had information that the defendant, after traveling to Utah, spoke to Leslie Udy about Mr. Alexander. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And in fact, one of the questions I think that you might have addressed involved the fact that she told Miss Udy about the fact that her children were going to play with Mr. Alexander's children. Do you remember that?
I do.
That's not avoiding thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, is it?
Well, it is.
How could it possibly be? Because isn't the person that was killed Travis Alexander?
It was.
Isn't it true that Travis Alexander was the subject of that conversation that we just discussed?
Yes, but she could not have had that conversation if she was admitting to the fact that she killed him. And so her conversation was her way of avoiding thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. At that point, the trauma in her mind, her perception was that she did it, no matter what she told me.
But isn't it true in that conversation that she's the one that brought up Mr. Alexander? Are you aware of that?
Well, I can only aware of what I read. I don't know for sure.
Overruled.
Are you aware of that? Yes or no?
I don't know if she was the one who brought it up, but there was a conversation to that effect.
Let's assume that it was her that brought it up. Wouldn't that be contrary to what we have listed in number one?
No, sir, not. It would not be.
The other thing that we know is that she sent a letter to the family. Are you aware of that?
To the whom?
The family of
Yes.
Mr. Alexander.
Yes, I am.
Again, she sent this letter to the family talking about the killing, right? You've read that, right?
Yes,
It's an 18-page letter, right?
yes,
And it's a very long, detailed letter, isn't it?
yes.
That doesn't show, she had to go to the effort of addressing it, didn't she?
Yes,
She had to go to the effort of getting it mailed, right?
yes.
And she had to go through the effort of finding the address, right?
I don't know whether she had the address or not, but yes. She had to find
If she did have the address, she would have to have addressed it, correct?
Correct.
So that is not an effort to avoid thoughts, feelings, or associations, conversations associated with the trauma, is it?
It is, if the trauma was killing Mr. Alexander.
Well, no, the
Because-
trauma here, again, we keep going back to this. Isn't the trauma that Mr. Alexander is dead? By whatever means?
Well, that's one aspect of the trauma, but the reality is her experience was that she did do the killing. And her perceptions and her emotions are tied into what actually occurred, not the story that was made up as a way of separating herself from the horror of what had happened on that day.
Going back to the PDS, you told us
$250
that
an
the trauma
hour.
didn't matter for purposes of your assessment, right?
That's correct,
But
because
you're
what the PDS measures were her emotional states and her perceptions of the trauma, whatever happened. And at the time that it was administered, she was telling this alternative story, but the reality was she was responding to the emotional components, which is what the PDS measures, as a person who did commit this crime.
And killing Mr. Alexander involved trauma, right?
Involved what?
Killing Mr. Alexander involved trauma, right?
Yes.
Whether it be by her hand or somebody else's hand, it involved trauma,
That's
right? So this is what this is talking about, whether her hand or somebody else's hand, isn't it? It doesn't distinguish, it doesn't say, but the trauma has to be associated with the killer killing the person, does it?
Objection, asked and answered.
As I indicated earlier, the trauma involved the killing of Mr. Alexander. She experienced that regardless of the story that she was telling at the time. And so her psychological reactivity and her psychological defense mechanisms were helping her avoid the thoughts, feelings, and conversations associated with her having been the perpetrator of that killing.
My question is, trauma doesn't distinguish between the killer or somebody who was a witness, does it?
Well, that aspect of the trauma, correct, that's correct.
Does not. The other thing that we know is that you've read her journals, right?
I did,
And you've read the journals post-killing of Mr. Alexander, right?
yes.
And in it, she goes out of her way to talk about Mr. Alexander, doesn't she?
Well, it's for the exact same reason.
But the bottom line is she does go out of her way, which of course expresses her thoughts and feelings in that journal, right?
Correct, but not,
about the trauma, right?
yes.
The other thing that we know is that Mr. Alexander had a memorial service. I believe she said either July 15th or July 16th are her words. You're aware of that,
I
right?
am.
And she attended the memorial service. You're aware of that, right?
I believe so.
And if she attended that memorial service,
half a slick.
certainly that is not
there.
an
Half a
effort
slick,
to
BBQ.
avoid thinking, feeling, or talking about the trauma, is it?
It was her way of avoiding dealing with the fact that she was responsible for that trauma by allowing herself to go through life at that time in a manner consistent with having been a victim of the trauma.
Now,
Not dealing with the fact that she did perpetrate the
I
trauma.
do. I'm
now
here
you're
with
adding
you
an
all.
extra element here, responsibility, aren't you? You're adding responsibility
you.
to the word trauma, aren't you? You're saying, well, she's trying to deal with her responsibility in this issue. And that's how she chose to deal with it.
Well, perhaps I misspoke there.
And this is irrespective of responsibility, isn't it?
An individual's inner perceptions is not independent of the nature of the trauma.
And all of this is based on what she told you, right?
That's correct.
And so you know that she goes to the memorial service, so she has to think about going to the memorial service, right?
Well, yes,
And so she has to book a flight, right?
yes.
Did you know that it was a flight that
Well,
she
I didn't know
took?
it was a flight, but she got
Do you
it.
want to see the receipt?
Pardon me?
Do you want to see the receipt that shows she took a flight?
I don't need to see the receipt.
All right. The other thing is, it requires that she make her way from the airport over to.
Thank you, Marilyn, for the gift of the 5 memberships. I appreciate it. Dave Umberger, welcome back. Laura Knudsen, Pampered Glamper, Robin Shermantine, and Ace King. Welcome back, and welcome to the cult. Grab your Kool-Aid with a C and an E because of copyright infringement, and grab your juror chair.
Oh, yeah.
Mesa, which is where she told us the memorial service was. She requires some thought there, right?
Yes,
Do you know whether or not she went over to the house during the time that she was here at the memorial service?
I don't know that.
And if she had gone over there, wouldn't that indicate something to you that she is doing anything but avoiding thoughts about the killing?
I don't know that she went to the house.
But assuming she did, if you assume that she went over to the house with somebody named Aaron, assume that, wouldn't that indicate that she was not attempting to avoid thinking about the trauma?
If her actions were part of an avoidance reaction, a defense mechanism, a dissociative reality, then it would be consistent with going to that site because she wouldn't have been responding as if she was the perpetrator. And so again, I don't know that she did go over there, but if you have something that I can read to confirm that, I would be appreciative.
That would make a difference for you?
Well, I'd like to
If,
see
for
that. Yeah, I
example,
don't
somebody
remember.
named Aaron Mortensen went over there with her?
I beg your pardon?
If somebody actually went over there to the crime scene with her afterwards? that would make-
Well, I'm at this point, I don't recall what the details were. I'm assuming that you're a man of your word and what you're telling me is actual. So I'll go along with that.
But here again, we're talking
I
about
think it's
trauma.
Juan's
It doesn't
handwriting.
distinguish between responsibility. It doesn't talk about responsibility. It just talks about trauma, doesn't it?
Well, there are different kinds of trauma and there
Right.
are different
And-
levels of trauma.
And you've told us that it doesn't make any difference in the trauma experienced by a police officer, right? It doesn't make any difference, does it? If it's a police officer or her, right? In terms of PTSD.
Well, it's a person's reactions to a trauma that determines whether or not they develop PTSD.
Didn't you just tell us when you were asked by the jurors, there was a question involving, are you saying that the defendant's PTSD is the same as that of a police officer? And you said that it was?
No, what I said was that it met the same criteria. It's not caused by the same factors,
Right.
but it has the same characteristics. Indeed, all cases of PTSD all fall under the same diagnostic criteria.
Right, because the trauma doesn't look at the responsibility of it, does it? In other words, it doesn't look as to whether you are rightful in doing it as opposed to wrongful in doing it, right?
It has an impact on one's perceptions of the intensity of the trauma.
Right. But whether or not a person has this intensity of this PTSD, it is PTSD, whether it's slight PTSD or strong PTSD, right?
Correct.
So when you say that the police officer's PTSD may not be as strong as hers, it's still PTSD, right?
It still falls under the diagnostic
Right.
criteria, yes.
Right. So that the trauma, in other words, whether you are killing wrongfully or rightfully in your mind, it's still trauma that triggers PTSD, right?
Both would be trauma, but of a different nature.
Sure, but it's trauma, right?
Yes,
And the same analysis applies to somebody in war in Afghanistan. You told us that, right?
yes.
As it does to the defendant, right?
Yet in terms of the diagnosis of PTSD.
Sure. And C1 illustrates that point, doesn't it?
Correct.
Well, isn't that special?
With regard to that, one of the things that we know is that she talked in the journals about Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes,
She talked over and over about him, didn't she?
yes.
Objection, asked and answered.
Overruled.
That's not an avoidance of feelings or thoughts about him, is it?
Yes, it can be, because if she's talking about him in flowing terms and how wonderful he was, it's a way of insulating her from the harsh reality that she did the killing. And so that method of dealing with his demise is very different than someone saying, oh my gosh, I've done this horrible thing and I take all full responsibility for that. It's a different way of dealing with a similar situation.
I'm
But
a
it's very
bathroom
different
Welsh.
in terms of the internal perceptions
I don't know
and
what
in
it
terms
means,
of
but
the emotional reactivity
I had
of
an
the
impulse
client.
and I went with it.
It requires thinking to write down what she did in her journals, right?
Yes,
And it requires thinking about the trauma, doesn't it?
yes, it does.
Irrespective of whether it's rightful or wrongful, it requires that. So there was
Under
nothing
an hour left of
that
this feller.
required her. For example, she wasn't attending a course in school that required her to write in those journals, right?
Correct.
It was a voluntary effort on her part, correct?
She has used journal writing as a way of dealing with her life since she was in school.
That's
This is
not
an
my question.
extension of that. This is not a new activity.
It's not my question. Nobody forced her to write in those
No,
journals,
no
did
one
they?
forced her to write.
And it required her to think about it before she wrote whatever she wrote in those journals,
Asked and
right?
answered.
Sustained.
Well, and it wasn't that she just had one entry in there. She had many entries, right?
Yes,
And she continued on up till at least a day or two until her arrest, right?
correct.
The other thing, sir, is that shortly after this killing, the defendant called Mr. Alexander's answering machine. Are you aware of that?
Yes,
That's not an effort to avoid thinking about the trauma, is it?
it's consistent, however,
The
with her psychological
ultimate
condition of having
shade
created an
of
alternative
it all.
reality, which allowed her to function in life because it was a way that she was able to deny having been the perpetrator of the crime.
In terms of that telephone call, it required her to pick up the telephone to make the call, didn't it?
Yes,
It required, whether or not she had him on speed dial or otherwise, it required her to manually do something by pushing at least one button, correct?
sure.
And it required her, while she was on the phone, to speak, right?
Yes,
And so even though the trauma had already occurred, it required her to express her thoughts, feelings in a one-sided conversation on the telephone, right?
She did do that.
Additionally, didn't she also send an email?
Yes.
And this email was sent to Mr. Alexander's account, wherever the account was, right?
Yes.
And so that required her to think about sitting down and composing an email to him, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
And she sat wherever it was that she sat, and she actually had to type in his name, a first letter, or however it worked, to at least get that going, right?
Yes.
She had to print out the words, right?
Yes.
And then she had to actually push the send button, right?
Yes.
If that's the case, then she's not avoiding thoughts, is she?
Those actions are consistent with someone who is avoiding the thought of having been the perpetrator of the killing.
But is she thinking about the trauma? I'm not asking about, it doesn't say killing there, right? Does it?
No.
In fact, it could be a car accident where nobody was killed, right? So trauma just indicates the event, whatever that event was, right?
That's right.
The other thing is that, didn't she also send some text messages over to him?
I believe so.
And these text messages were after the killing, right?
Yes.
She wasn't avoiding thinking about him when she sent those text messages, was she?
It was a method that is consistent with her behaving in a way that reduced the impact of the trauma on her, because by engaging in that alternative behavior, she was not having to get in touch with her feelings of responsibility for his demise.
She was trying to stage a scene, is what she told us.
Well, that's what she did. She didn't tell that to me.
This characterizes her testimony.
Overruled.
Wouldn't that be inconsistent if that's what they're doing, staging a scene? Wouldn't that be inconsistent with
She
avoiding
writes her
thoughts?
questions in
In fact,
orange
you're
that she
actually
really
really
thinks are
thinking
gonna
about the
get
trauma
wrong.
then if you're trying to stage a scene, aren't you?
Well, that was not told to me.
Well, let's assume then that that's what she said, that she was trying to stage the scene. Wouldn't that indicate that just the opposite?
Not necessarily.
Objection, Judge. May we approach?
You may. Stating the last objection, the jury is directed to disregard the last question and answer. You may continue.
Sir, with regard to avoiding responsibility, isn't the idea, if somebody wants to avoid responsibility involving the trauma, actually the antithesis of what you have here?
No.
Avoiding responsibility on something, isn't that saying something that you are thinking about the trauma, but you just don't want to be held responsible?
It doesn't say responsibility. The criteria do not say responsibility.
It does say efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, right?
Yes.
And if someone's thinking about their responsibility, isn't that contrary to avoiding thoughts associated with the trauma?
Yes. There's a difference, however, between the trauma of observing someone being killed and recognizing that you killed the individual.
And I understand that you keep saying that, but the DSM-4 doesn't say that, does it?
The definition of trauma is not contained within that particular criteria.
I understand that now you're trying to be a wordsmith involving trauma, but
Characterization.
Sustained.
with regard to the word trauma, are you saying that the word trauma means specifically that it has to apply to somebody who killed somebody unlawfully? Is that what you're
No,
saying?
of course not.
Right, it can be lawful or unlawful, right?
Correct.
Just as in the example that you gave in Afghanistan where a soldier killed somebody, right?
Correct.
That's a lawful killing, right?
Yes.
As opposed to another killing outside of this courtroom where somebody takes a gun and shoots somebody, right?
That's right.
And so trauma applies to both of them, doesn't it?
It does, but there's a different essence to each of those traumas. People react emotionally differently to those types of traumas.
They may react emotionally differently, but anybody who is diagnosed with PTSD has to walk through these portals here in DSM-4, don't they?
Yes, absolutely.
And did you ever work for the military?
Not extensively, no.
Well, do you have any information about how the military does its thing with regard to diagnosing somebody with PTSD?
Objection, Judge. On this vote.
Approach. You may continue.
Doesn't the military, when they, if you know, when they diagnose somebody with PTSD, don't they follow the criteria in the DSM-4?
I think it's a
Yes.
Yankee
Same thing with a police officer
Candle
that you
scent?
talked about.
essence of trauma.
maybe in the Times article that you talked about, if that officer was found to have been diagnosed with PTSD, he would have, by necessity, have been diagnosed pursuant to DSM-4, correct?
Right. I don't believe the officer was diagnosed with PTSD, however.
But assuming that he had. Well,
Yes.
you said that you've worked with police officers
Yes, the
before,
same
right?
criteria would apply.
So one of the other things that you talked about was this email or this instant messaging involving the defendant and Mr. Alexander, where he called her 3 salacious names. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you also remember the other part of that conversation where Mr. Alexander was upset and told her?
Objection. Maybe approach.
Sir, do you remember saying that you reviewed a conversation where the victim, Mr. Alexander, called the defendant certain names? Do you remember that
I
one?
do
Miss?
recall that, yes.
And it was Miss Wilmot that asked you that, right? Do you
Yes.
remember that? And you were able to tell us that you had actually reviewed that, right?
Yes.
But as part of that same conversation, isn't it true that Mr. Alexander was upset and said, do you remember reading that he was nothing more than a dildo with a heartbeat to Miss Arias? Do you remember reading that part?
I did.
So that's part of the same conversation, isn't it?
Well, I believe it occurred in the same time frame.
No, not the same time frame. Do you want to take a look at it and see, to refresh your recollection to see?
Yes, that would be helpful.
This is Exhibit 275. Go ahead and take your time and read it. This is that, and then the other ones are. I want you to review the whole thing to see if it includes those words previously also.
The other words?
Or do you just recognize it by looking at it?
No, I read the part that you had
Go ahead
referred
and
me
take a
to.
look at it on the other section. You may want to start at the beginning.
And what is it specifically you're asking me to find?
I'm just asking you to read it to see if it's the same conversation where he used those 3 names so that we can follow up.
Okay, I did come across the 3-hole
Sure,
wonder.
don't, just read it. Did I ask you to tell me? Just read it, okay?
The
Once
whole
you're
thing?
done reading,
Okay.
let me know.
All right, didn't want to take it the first time.
And in terms of where the complaint by Mr. Alexander appears, would you say it comes, the way you were reading it from this way forward, that it comes after he makes the derogatory comments about her?
I think it came after.
He wishes
Well,
he
why don't you
invented
take
the
a look,
post
okay?
office.
This thing about, so his comments about her came after the derogatory comment about himself? Do you know?
Objection, Judge. These are out of sequence. We just discussed.
Approach, please.
And so these statements were made as a part of the same conversations, weren't they?
Yes.
In fact, he's complaining to her about her taking advantage of him sexually, right?
Objection. Beyond the scope, relevance.
Overruled.
Right?
Yes.
And sir, does the date of this conversation, the one that you reviewed prior to coming to court, did it have a date on it?
I'm sure that it did, but I don't remember the date.
Was the date important to you?
Well, the relative time frame was important, yes.
And the one that you read did have a date and time, right?
I believe it did.
Take a look at Exhibit 275 to see if that, it may or may not refresh your recollection as to the date and time of this conversation.
$526.08.
Well, without saying it, did it refresh your recollection or not?
Honestly, no.
Okay, then that's fine.
Doesn't remember.
Okay.
No. He pins
One of
cards
the things
to
that you talked
butterflies.
to
He
us
collects the
about
cards,
in
pins them
response
to
to
the
a juror
butterflies.
question was this fight or flight syndrome. Do you remember
Yes.
talking about that? And one of the things that you said was that, and
Yes.
you analogized it to animals. Do you
All
remember
the
saying
things.
that?
Yes.
That the first thing that happens is there's this flight, correct?
There's an impulse to flee.
Right, and that's the first thing, in your opinion, that happens, right?
As a rule, yes.
And then if the animal can't get away, cornered, so to speak, then there's this instinct to fight, right?
Yes.
And this fighting is instinctual, is what you said, correct?
Yes.
And however, with animals, as soon as the fight is over, the vanquished is gone, then that ends the encounter, doesn't it?
Yes.
The winner, if you will, of this battle, whatever it was, doesn't then stick around and do other things with regard to the other animal that it's vanquished, does it?
Typically not.
Typically no means they just go about their business after that, right?
After recouping from their wounds, yes,
If they have any wounds, right? They may not have any wounds, right?
that's possible too.
So what they do is they're done, they move, and they go away, right?
Yes.
And they don't stick around, nosing around to try to take advantage of the dead carcass or anything
Depends on
like
if it
that.
was 2 gas
right?
tanks or 3.
Well, some animals kill for food.
2
Right.
fight,
So
3 flight.
they would consume the carcass.
But that's not the situation that we have here. According to you, we have a situation where there's an attacker, right? And then the other animal flees first, right? According to what you explained to us, right?
In that hypothetical,
Right,
yes.
that's what we were talking about. In that hypothetical, once the winner is determined, let's assume by death, they don't stick around, do they?
No,
They take off, right?
yes.
Could it be, sir, that in this particular case, with regard to everything that we've seen, for example, your finding of PTSD, some of your findings of the elements and your scoring of the PDS and your Milan test, could it be, sir, that you looked at those results and because of the fact that it appears you're not objective anymore, that perhaps I could have colored the way you viewed your conversations and your results under the PTSD?
What could have colored my opinion?
Didn't you tell us that you had compassion for the defendant?
We're trained in empathy. Psychologists are trained in empathy. That is the capacity to get into the minds and feelings of the client, to assist them and to help understand when you do an evaluation. It is not necessarily compassion, even though Webster may say that. It is certainly not sympathy. And we are very, very
Webster's
carefully
wrong.
trained not to allow our empathic listening to lead us into any kind of over-identification with the client. That is what psychologists are trained for, sir. We are trained to be neutral observers of either an evaluation situation or we're doing psychotherapy in a psychotherapeutic situation. We are trained not to over-identify with the client. It's crucial training.
Do you remember in a response to a question and follow-up by the defense counsel that you said that you had compassion?
I have been accused of being a compassionate person.
And sir, didn't you also say when you and I were talking about it, that you felt sorry, at least during that
You didn't miss
first
much.
interview with the defendant?
No, I didn't say I felt sorry.
Did you use the word sorry in connection with the first interview with the defendant?
I don't remember saying that.
Do you remember that you used the word sorry when we were discussing the Webster's definition?
Well, we were talking about semantics at that point, so I may have, but that's not the context in which you're using it now.
Is that yes or no? Do you remember using the word sorry?
I don't remember using the word sorry.
And with regard to the word compassion, do you remember that you were the one that introduced it into this
That's
conversation?
right.
And isn't it true, sir, that this, to use your word, compassion, entered into your evaluation in this case?
No, what I said was that I have been accused of being a compassionate person. Empathy factored into this evaluation, as it would with any person I work with, because we are trained to be empathic listeners, but we are also trained to remain completely objective in doing our work, whether it's psychotherapeutic or evaluative.
And you're saying that you were trained to have this empathy, right?
I don't think that people are trained as much as a tendency to be an empathic person is brought out and then reinforced and modified by our training.
You were saying, though, just now, that you were trained to have empathy for the person that you are assessing, right? Isn't that what you just said?
We are trained to become empathic listeners.
Empathic listeners means you have empathy, correct? While
That's
listening.
right. We use empathy as a tool for evaluative purposes and for therapeutic
It
purposes.
doesn't make you empathetic.
In terms of this empathy
It
or
makes you
this compassion,
manipulative.
whatever word you want to use, this is part
And how
of your training, right?
Yes.
Talking about it.
Isn't good record keeping, for
Genuine
example,
empathic listening
such
is not
as
manipulative.
detailing
This is.
what it was that you found with regard to PTSD and writing it out? Isn't that something that's also, for example, exhibit number 544? Isn't it also part of training that you're accurate as to the subsections that you're finding and when you write them out? Isn't there some training for that?
Well, absolutely.
And isn't there some training that indicates that that being accurate is one of the things that's sacrosanct in this business?
Yes, I omitted a few letters and numbers, and the rest of my report, had it been read, maybe I'm sure you read it, is filled with accuracy.
I'm saying, though, isn't that part of your training?
Yes.
Right? Isn't it also part of your training in the PDS that you need to score it effectively or accurately, right?
Accurately, I did score it accurately for the portions of the test that were pertinent to my use of the test.
I understand, but you came up with 3 different numbers. You came up with 15, 16, and 17, correct?
Those numbers didn't matter because I did not use that data, and it had nothing to do with the use of the PDS test as a confirmation for my diagnosis.
Yes or no? 15, 16, and 17 are 3 different numbers.
They are 3 different numbers. Yeah.
And you are taught to be very accurate with regard to the results of these tests, right?
And if the results were critical, they would have been checked several times.
Sir, isn't it true that you are trained to be accurate in your results?
Yes.
Sir. So that you've been telling us with regard to this issue involving the defendant and that you would have received all this training about having empathy, compassion, but not letting it affect you, right?
Yes.
And you've also been telling us about the training and how the training is with regard to recording and how you attempted to follow that. And in your 35 years, you have had training in how to keep reports and records straight, right?
Yes.
You weren't successful with the records and the reports, were you? You weren't accurate.
A typographical error is not equivalent to being a neutral, empathic listener.
I'm not asking about that. I'm asking, although you had training, you still failed in being accurate. We're looking at exhibit number 544. You weren't accurate there.
I admit a mistake was made in typing.
And just like you've had your 35 years of training, you made a mistake. Just like you had your 35 years of being compassionate and empathic, isn't it true that in this case, you lost your objectivity?
Objection.
Absolutely not.
Overruled.
Absolutely not.
I don't have anything else.
All right, looks like we have one additional juror question. Are there any other questions from the jury? Counsel, please approach.
Dr. Samuels, you were just asked by the state about the conversation that occurs
Looks
by
like that
instant message
question
that you
was
were just
objected to.
reviewed.
Yes.
And you were asked about whether or not you remembered the statement that Travis or Mr. Alexander felt like he was a dildo with a heartbeat, right?
Yes.
You have also, in review of this case, you've listened to an audio tape of basically a sex tape, right?
Yes.
Where they're having phone sex.
Yes.
And during that conversation where Mr. Alexander is talking about what he wants from Miss Arias and talking about his particular sexual desires, anywhere on that tape, does it appear that he feels like he's being used?
No.
Anywhere on that tape, does it appear that he didn't want to have any conversations like phone sex like that?
No.
Did he ever appear unwilling?
Dog toy with the heartbeat.
No.
You were asked questions about avoiding the trauma and avoiding the trauma of killing Travis
Yes.
just a few minutes ago. If she's avoiding the trauma, does that mean avoiding thinking about what actually happened?
She's doing anything in her power to avoid reacting emotionally to what has happened.
So in doing so, if she has a conversation with Leslie Udy about something that can never happen, like Travis's children playing with Jodi's children someday down the road, is that avoidance or is that thinking about the trauma?
It's not thinking about the trauma. It's more like avoidance of the trauma.
And why is it more like avoidance?
Because it's dealing with an unreality. It's not dealing with the fact that I killed Mr. Alexander. It's a way of putting an obstacle between what's going on in her life at the moment and the reality of what happened.
And in going to the memorial and paying her respects at the memorial, is that a way of avoiding what actually happened?
Absolutely. It's living in a fantasy world.
And when she journals after June 4th, and she journals about nice things about Mr. Alexander, trying to remember him in a nice way, is that avoiding what actually happened on June 4th?
Yes.
And when she calls him and leaves a voicemail, she's not talking on the voicemail about what just happened, right?
Correct.
Sustained.
Is she talking about on the voicemail what just happened?
No.
No, and is she in fact talking about things that didn't happen?
Correct.
And is that avoiding the reality of what she did on June 4th?
Yes, in my opinion.
Same thing with her email.
The same thing with my email and my professional opinion, yes.
And in sending flowers to Travis's grandmother.
Yes.
Again, like showing respects at the memorial. Is that something that is avoiding what actually happened on June 4th?
It's avoiding coming to terms with what she was responsible for on June 4th.
Okay. You were asked questions about her being suicidal.
Yes.
And with regard to her journal writing, did she express bouts of depression?
Yes, she did. She suffered from bouts of depression.
All right. And to your knowledge, was there ever any type of intervention or anything needed during her high school because of any type of suicidal thoughts?
To my knowledge, there was never an actual suicidal attempt.
All right. And once you spoke to her after June 4th of 2008, what was her ideation about suicide at that point?
Well, she didn't have a specific plan, but she said it was part of her plan not to live long enough to go to trial.
And if she were to have written letters to her family members saying goodbye and have written a letter where she drew a tombstone and wrote what she wanted to say, is that further evidence that she's actually thinking about suicide?
Yes.
Sustained.
It was, may we approach?
Sustaining the objection, jury is directed to disregard the question and the response. You may continue.
Dr. Samuels, if you were aware that Ms. Arias wrote letters to her grandmother to pass out to her different family members saying goodbye, is that further information that you would use to support the idea that her suicidal ideation is stronger after June 4th?
Yes.
You remember when Mr. Martinez was playing a clip of you during an interview that you had with Mr. Martinez?
Yes.
And he didn't show you the transcript, did he?
No.
And he didn't play the entire interview for you before court, right?
No, he did not.
And he just played the clip in court?
Yes.
And
he was in the interview.
he was asking you questions about whether or not Miss Arias had difficulty falling asleep. Is that right?
Correct.
And ultimately, what we heard on the clip was just very short about that now she's able to get sleep.
Correct.
Okay. Judge, may I approach?
I'm going to check since he hasn't indicated he doesn't remember any. He hasn't any. It's improper impeachment.
Well, there's no question before the witness. You may hand the document to him and then ask a question.
Okay, well, then let's do it this way. All right, Dr. Samuels, do you remember during this conversation, how long was your interview with Mr. Martinez? Do you remember about?
I think it was about an hour and a half or so.
Do you remember it being longer, needing to ask for a break?
Judge, I'm meeting.
Overruled.
I do recall we did take a break.
Okay.
Yes.
And during this conversation, right before you talk about that she's now able to get sleep. Do you recall that the actual conversation had to do with the
Nope.
fact that she was taking tranquilizers?
Objection leading.
Sustained.
Do you remember what the conversation was about right before the short clip that we heard?
Yes.
Okay, what was it
I
about?
recall that she had told me
But he
around
can't
prior
remember
to
how
that
long
time
it was.
that she was taking tranquilizers and her sleep had become easier.
Okay, and
Trazodone, I think.
how long was she taking the trazodone? Trazodone is a tranquilizer, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and how long was she taking the trazodone?
I think she said 6 months.
Okay, actually, do you remember it being 8 months?
Perhaps it could have been 8 months.
Okay, and was she taking that for what reason?
She was having difficulty sleeping and she was anxious and it helped her sleep.
Okay, and during this conversation that you're having with Mr. Martinez during the interview, are you telling him about these tranquilizers?
Yes.
And are you telling him why she needed to take the tranquilizers?
Yes.
And that, did she need to take these tranquilizers before June 4th of 2008?
No, she didn't report that she needed them.
And at some point, did she stop taking the tranquilizers?
Yes.
And is that the tiny little bit of a clip that we heard is after she stops taking the tranquilizers?
To my recollection, yes.
So after she stops taking the tranquilizers, now she's able to get sleep?
Apparently, yes.
So would it be incorrect to, if you were to take the entire conversation, not just the little clip that Mr. Martinez played for us, but if you were to take the entire conversation, would it be correct to say that she did have trouble sleeping?
Objection leading.
World.
Yes.
And that she needed to take medication? Did she need to take medication because she had trouble sleeping?
Yes.
Objection lack of foundation. Taking time.
Wilmot's getting a little
Judge,
feisty.
it's part of the same conversation we're talking about.
Spicy.
During the conversation that you had with Mr. Martinez, during the interview, did you talk to him about the tranquilizers?
Yes.
And did you talk to him about Miss Arias taking those tranquilizers for 8 months?
Yes.
And did you talk to him about taking those tranquilizers, that she took those tranquilizers when she, just after June 4th, when she was initially arrested?
Yes.
And that she had to take those tranquilizers because she couldn't sleep?
Correct.
Objection leading.
World.
Is that right?
Yes.
And so the tiny clip that we heard was just the tail, is that just the tail end of this conversation during the interview?
It was.
And just that tail end of the conversation of the interview, is that just
Yes.
talking about how she
Jennifer
felt
Wilmot,
after she took
not
8 months of
Lisa.
tranquilizers?
Yes.
Wilmot. Very different.
But you didn't get to review this when Mr. Martinez was playing the clip for you, did you?
No, I did not.
Lack of foundation relevance as to when he reviewed it and when not.
And why is that, Mr. Reed?
What was your answer?
Devastating to my case.
I did not have an opportunity to review it prior to the clip being played.
He didn't show it to you, did he?
No.
Objection asked and answered.
Sustained.
Gotta look for all her orange questions.
You remember you were
that she
asked
wrote
about
down.
the scoring for the PDS test?
Yes.
Okay, and I know this was gone over quite a bit, but it seems like you weren't able to always finish your answers. So,
Objection as to the characterization relevance.
Sustained.
let's talk about that for a second. You had, you were telling us something about those numbers 15, 16, or 17, right?
Yes.
Do those numbers make any difference with regard to whether or not the test confirms the
I like our
diagnosis
Wilmot
for
better.
PTSD?
No, they have
Just
nothing
saying.
to do with that at all.
Why don't they?
Because they don't count in reaching that first level of criteria. What does count are the number of items that are checked off in a particular box by the client. And in each case, for each of the 6 criteria, or actually they were more, she met the foundation, the diagnostic criteria for PTSD before any numbers were calculated at all. Those numbers only impact the degree of symptom severity and the total number of symptoms reviewed or endorsed. I did not refer to those in my report. I was not interested in those numbers. What I was interested in, does the test support my contention that based upon all of my knowledge, scientific and psychological probability, that she had PTSD? And the answer was yes. It met it, and in fact, it exceeded it in each of those categories.
Now, those categories,
Because you
when you're
added-
talking about, if the number was 15, does that, So does that make any difference with regard to the confirmation of the diagnosis?
No.
No, but it shows that you added 2 for no reason.
And you're talking about the different categories. I'm showing you
Tests
what's
were
been
scored
in evidence as
differently.
Exhibit 550.
Yes,
Okay, so we're looking at A, B, and C, right?
that's correct.
Okay, so this is part of your scoring, right?
That's correct.
And this scoring is something that is specifically, are you trained to do this with regard to this particular test?
Yes,
And this particular scoring under A, B, and C, is this part of what helps to confirm a diagnosis of PTSD?
that's right. And then below, there's an area where you can check, is the criterion met for A, B, C, D, E, and F?
Okay, and I see yes, yes, and yes for ABC, is that right?
That's correct.
And then on to D, E, and F.
That's correct.
So is it the same thing with scoring on D, E, and F?
Yes,
And then we look at whether the criteria was met.
that's correct.
And we see yes, yes, and yes.
That's correct.
So whether or not this number down here in criteria A through F, and we see that number 17,
Yes.
whether that number is a 15, 16, or 17, does that have anything to do at all with your confirmation of PTSD?
No,
Does it in any way help this test to be accurate or not accurate with regard to its confirmation
why
of
did you do it?
PTSD?
no, it does not.
Then why
Dr.
did you
Samuels,
do
the
it?
jurors have some additional questions for you.
I
In
bet
your
they do.
office, do you have books that you would willingly offer to patients free of charge?
Yes,
Are you able to view external information in this case, such as websites, news broadcasts, or any other medium?
I have assiduously avoided any contact with the media.
Did Jodi tell
don't believe
you
you.
that she had purchased a gun in July of 2008 intending to kill herself?
No,
Did she tell you about a plan to kill herself with a razor in jail?
no.
Sounds like she's lying.
What is the difference between covering up and creating an alternative reality?
Covering up is an involuntary,
Yes.
is a voluntary action. It's creating an alibi for yourself. The
Like burying a
alternative
gun in a
reality
box
is
in
a
the desert?
psychological process known as a defense mechanism. And it occurs through subconscious forces. The individual who is so afflicted by that oftentimes is not even aware of the depth of their distortion, of their cognitive distortion.
Follow up, Ms. Wilmot.
No. No, ma'am.
Doctor, with regard to
Sit
the defense
down, Miss
mechanism
Wilmot.
that you
Yes.
just talked about, the defense mechanism,
Ms.
is that
Shireen said Miss
that's
Wilmot.
part of creating an alternate reality?
Yes,
And when somebody creates an alternative reality, does that help them to not have to deal with what the reality is?
correct. It insulates them from the feelings associated with the worst part of the trauma.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm pretty sure she
And,
still is
um,
practicing.
When this happens, when our minds use this as a defense mechanism to avoid thinking about what really happened, is there often associated with that acute stress?
Gonna soak
Yes.
up the sun.
How is that associated?
Well, it's the stress that's driving the distortion, the creation of the distortion. Once the stress is removed, very often there's no need for the distortion any longer, and the client is better able to face reality.
Okay, so saying that if the stress is removed, let's talk about specifically with Jodi, then if the stress of June 4th of 2008 is removed on June 5th, then why is there this defense mechanism occurring when she speaks to Detective Flores in the beginning, or when she's sending an email to Travis?
Well, the stress isn't gone just because the next day occurs. She
Okay.
hasn't dealt with it. She hasn't processed that. There are still gaps in her memory as to what happened. But the fact remains that as long as a person is in conflict and is dealing with such repressed feelings, the possibility of this alternative reality developing does exist.
Every time
In its
he
most
pronounces
extreme
the
form, it
TY,
would take the form of a
I want
dissociative
to
identity
tighten his
disorder.
tie.
But that was not the case here, but that's the best example that I can give.
Okay, so you said as long as the person is still in conflict.
The person is in conflict, the person is still experiencing
12 minutes?
distress, the person is still experiencing the physiological effects of stress.
can't handle
Yes,
the
it would
truth.
very likely sustain defense mechanism.
Okay, and so is that something, would you consider Jodi still being in conflict when she's not able to deal with the fact of what happened on June 4th? Is that the kind of conflict you're talking about?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so can
probably have
somebody
to
be
ask her
in
to
that
come out
type
of
of
retirement.
conflict then until the point of a year, even years?
Oh, it can happen. Yes, it certainly can happen.
All right, and when Jodi eventually, bless you, when Jodi eventually came out of this conflict and was able to actually tell you and tell her attorney what happened on June 4th of 2008, how did she feel?
Objection. Characterizing, actually.
Sustained.
When she told you what she says actually
Be quiet.
happened on June 4th and the times
quiet.
after that, how did she feel about being able to release that information finally?
Even before you start. That was a preemptive. Just know I have a whole bag of
When Jodi talked to
with
you
your
about
name
what
on it.
she says actually happened on June 4th of 2008 and times after that, how did she feel about being able to release that information?
She told me that she felt as if a tremendous pressure, a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders.
And is that further evidence or is that further support for you of a defense mechanism versus covering up?
Yes.
When you were speaking to her about, whenever she would talk to you about the thoughts of killing herself, okay, that's what we're going to talk about for a second. If she would have given you a plan that she actually had a plan to do, what would you have done with that information?
Well, if a client gives you a plan for suicide, then you must take immediate steps. And depending upon the circumstances, you would contact the appropriate individuals. That could be
Jodi hasn't
they're
responded
at large,
to any
it
of
could be a
this,
family member, it could be
which
the
tells me
doctor,
one of two
it could be
things.
an emergency suicide
One,
line. In case of the jail, had that
she's still
occurred,
taking a
I would
lot
have
of pills.
contacted the jail authorities, the medical department, and alerted them to
She's
this
hanging out with
possibility, as well as her
bacon.
attorney.
And if
Just kidding.
And if she would have talked to you about the fact that she did actually have a plan to kill herself and was going to use a razor and went so far as actually trying to cut herself so that it was something that she did do. If she had told you that, is that something then that you would have had to have been on alert for with the jail?
Absolutely.
And when the jail goes on alert that somebody, an inmate might actually be might actually try to commit suicide, do you have knowledge as to what the jail is going to do with that person?
I do.
What do they do?
Well, they put the person on suicide watch, where they're monitored every few minutes. They would have a consult with the psychiatrist. Medication evaluation would be done, possibly placing the individual on antidepressant medication, although antidepressant medication doesn't begin working immediately, but at least it would be initiated. And mostly they would be very closely observed and probably placed in isolation.
All right. And so when you talk about being closely observed, that means they lose any semblance of privacy that they might have.
That is
right?
correct.
And when you talk about being in isolation, that means they lose any type of social interaction.
Sustained.
Do they lose any type of social interaction when somebody is placed in isolation?
They have no social interaction.
Okay. And
boy.
when somebody is placed for suicide watch, do they also take everything away from them?
The person is, yes, everything is taken away from the individual, sometimes in extreme cases, even their clothing. Although I don't know that would be the case here, but nonetheless, everything that is potentially a risk is taken away. So you're really isolated.
So when you talk about that in some cases, they'll take their clothing away because potentially they can strangle themselves, right?
That's correct. They can hang themselves with their clothing.
And so hang themselves. And so that's why they would take their clothing away.
That's right.
In your experience with what you've seen happen to people who have any type of a report of a plan of suicide, is it somewhat humiliating for the person?
Objection, no, let's be on the scope of the question.
Sustained.
Judge may reproach. So if
Every
any
time you
report
lose
of,
an
if there's any report of suicide, the jail takes it
Whine
seriously.
about
Is that what you're
Oh,
saying?
very seriously, yes, they do a good job.
And what they do to somebody after that report can be dehumanizing.
Objection, meeting, be on the scope of the question.
Overruled, you may answer.
The consequences can be somewhat dire for the individual, as they are always suspect of engaging in potential suicide behavior again. There may be changes to their living arrangements. Sometimes I know of cases, again, in the men's jail, I don't know so much about the women's jail, but where they're placed in isolation after that. So the outcome is not predictable.
All right. And you said you were asked a question about when patients come to see you in your office, if you've ever given them books.
Oh, yes.
And is that something that you do?
Well, that's just the way that I did my work. I would buy a carton of books that I felt were appropriate. And especially in cases where individuals couldn't afford to buy the book, I would give it to them to help them get started in their self-help aspect of their therapy. And similarly, when I did evaluations for people, because I could not serve as a therapist,
or you could just
I would
walk them
sometimes give them
through
a
different
self-help
tools
book
to
if I
add to
felt
their
it would be useful
toolkit,
for them.
rather than just
That
sending them
would
to
be
read a
just
book.
something that I did in my practice.
All right. So people who come to see you in
Just a thought,
your
sir.
office, you said that you would give them a self-help book and that would be part of therapy?
If they came to me for therapy, it could be, yes.
Okay. And if they came to you for therapy, is that something that then you would follow up with them during their therapeutic sessions?
Oh, absolutely. And we would use the book perhaps as a guideline for some of the therapeutic interventions. They would have homework assignments based upon books and workbooks. There are a lot of books, not just one. And they would be given homework assignments that sometimes were key to the book and sometimes not key to the book.
Your
Okay.
mother
And
was
then
a hamster,
with evaluations that you're doing where you're not doing therapy, did you also give books to people who you were doing evaluations for?
On occasion, if I felt it might be helpful to them.
All right. And did you ever follow up with those people when it's an evaluative
Never.
process? Okay. All right. Thank you. Nothing further.
And there was much
Martinez,
rejoicing.
follow-up.
Sir, did you gain some knowledge from some other area since our cross-examination? Did you? In the area involving the jail?
Did I gain some knowledge?
Yes, did you go out and do some research?
No.
Well, do you remember we were talking about the book and your gift of the book to the defendant? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And do you remember that you blurted out during cross-examination, well, she was suicidal? Do you remember saying that?
Objection is characteristic testimony.
Overruled.
I didn't say she was suicidal.
Didn't you say that she wanted to commit suicide?
She said that she did not plan to be around for the duration of this process.
Are you saying, sir, that you didn't use the word suicide when we were talking about the book? Yes or no?
I don't recall. I may have, but I don't recall.
Yeah. And if the record reflects that you did use the word suicide, sir, would you have any reason to doubt that?
Objection argumented.
Overruled.
I
No.
told her to object again.
So if you use the word suicide with regard to the issue involving the book, do you remember that the prosecutor then followed up and said
Honestly,
to you,
I'd
well,
wanna
did you
yell at him
report
at
it
this
to any
point,
of the
too.
officers in the Maricopa County jail system? Do you remember me asking that?
I do.
And do you remember that you told me back then, well, I don't know anybody to report it to?
Objection, Judge. Can we also the prosecutor not yell at
I'm going to object to the speaking objection. She can,
Sustained to speaking objection. If you wish to approach, you may.
Okay, then can we approach?
did you tell us at that time, well, I don't know who reported to at the jail? Do you remember saying that?
At the Durango jail, I did not know who to report it to, and there was no need for me to report it because there was no plan. However, had there been a plan, I would have found out who to report it to.
Bottom line is you told us that you didn't know who to report it to at the Durango jail, right?
I've never had to report it there.
I'm not asking you about that. Isn't it true whether or not you've had to report it? You came in just now and you started to tell us all the procedures involving how to report a suicide at the Maricopa County Jail, didn't you?
At the male jails, yes, because I've had experience with that.
And I'm not asking you about that because you weren't asked about the male jails in the follow-up, were you?
Yes,
You were asked about Miss Arias. Don't you remember her asking you that?
yes.
She wasn't asking you about the male jails, was she?
But I used that as an example. I qualified my answer.
You didn't say that.
Okay, I thought I did.
Objection, Judge. This characterizes this testimony.
Overruled. You may answer.
You didn't say that, did you?
I'd have to see the transcript.
So with regard to this issue then, are you saying that you lack the knowledge to know at the Maricopa County Jail when it involves a female as to who you reported to? Is it yes or no?
I don't know the specific person. I know what procedures to follow, but I've never had to do it there. So I would have had to find out who is the proper person to report this to.
At the Durango jail,
At
right?
the Durango jail.
Actually, there's a problem with that because the defendant stays at the Estrella jail, doesn't she?
Well, then it's the Estrella jail.
Well, no, it's not just Isn't it true?
Sustained.
Isn't it true, sir, that the Maricopa County jail system only houses female inmates at the Estrella jail?
Right, which is on Durango Street, so I'm sorry I got it.
Did I ask you where it was?
No, but I'm explaining my answer.
Right, no, you said that it was at the Durango jail, right?
Excuse me, I meant the Estrella jail on Durango.
There is also a Durango jail though, isn't there?
That's correct.
And so you knew that, right?
Well, of course I know that.
Beyond the scope.
Of the world.
And so now you know, when you were asked about it in terms of the suicide issue, you now know that, or you're now telling us, or told us before, that you would go to certain personnel at the Maricopa County Jail, yes or no, if the defendant had indicated true suicide, right?
Yes.
Not today,
So the other
Satan,
thing
not
that you
today.
asked about was about the books that you may or may not give to people, correct?
Correct.
At your office. Those books that you indicated are self-help books, right?
Correct.
By definition, self-help books involve treatment, correct?
No, they involve self-help.
And self-help is not to better the person?
Well, maybe to better the person, but they have to engage in the effort to help themselves. They don't have any external help from me if I'm not their therapist.
That's not, let's put it this way, it's not for the purpose of assessment, those self-help books, are they?
Not for the purpose of assessment, no.
And with regard to this issue about covering up and creating an alternative reality, the bottom line in this case, not the bottom line, covering up involves not telling the truth, correct?
Yes.
And creating an alternative reality, by your definition, also indicates not telling the truth, right?
Well, not telling the truth to me implies that the person has voluntary control over the story they're telling.
And I know that you want to say that, but
Objection. Argumentative.
Sustained.
yes or no, isn't it true that creating an alternative reality is talking about something that's not truthful? Yes or no?
Yes.
I don't have anything else.
Oh, she's excited about this one, y'all. She's psyched. She is ready to go. Look at that smirk. Oh, man. Oh.
And now for something completely different.
And now it's time for ChatGPT Mad Libs Night Court Edition. I don't know what order they go in. I was waiting for this to be done so we could just have a nice break. I love the fact that you all are talking about the barbecue sauce because it's so good and people finally understand how I feel about it. Oh, it's fantastic. All right. So, that being said, it's time for story. That's not the answer. That's not the track that we want. No, that's not it either. This isn't a sad thing. That works. That's good. Holler at me if it's too loud. The title of this story is Heartbeats, Laughter, and Not a Pyramid Scheme. A love story. In the quirky town of Willowbrook, where even the mayor had a pet chicken named Sir Cluxalot. Don't know why that's important. Here we are. An unexpected love story unfolded. The town was a canvas of oddities, where street signs did the tango during windstorms, and where the local bakery proudly displayed its world's okayest croissants sign. And at the center of this delightful chaos were two characters as peculiar as the town itself. Gus Searcy and Dr. Richard Samuels. Gus, with a mop of unruly hair and a smile that could rival a supernova, was the proprietor of the town's beloved bookstore, Pages of Whimsy. He possessed a unique talent for turning mundane mishaps into uproarious tales, each told with an enthusiastic flourish that left his audience in stitches. And then there was Dr. Richard Samuels, a man whose presence was like a black hole for normalcy. That's funny. With his lab coat perpetually askew, and his ability to trip over his own shoelaces, no matter how securely tied. He was a walking, talking comedy routine that provided endless amusement to the townsfolk. As fate would have it, their lives collided one fateful day at the annual Willowbrook Pie-Eating Contest, a serious affair that involved copious amounts of whipped cream and very little actual pie consumption. Amid the chaos of whipped cream mishaps and slippery pie tins, Gus and Richard found themselves tangled in a hilariously sticky situation. Gus, sputtering and covered in whipped cream. Well, this wasn't exactly how I envisioned the first meeting, but I gotta say, you're the cherry on top of this mess. Richard, wiping whipped cream off his glasses. Oh, I see what you did there. Very punny. Gus grinning. Just trying to keep up with the town's comedic standards. The laughter bubbled forth from that whipped cream-covered encounter set the tone for their relationship. An unconventional pairing that was sprinkled with humor and an abundance of heart. Enter Sarah, Gus's best friend and self-proclaimed matchmaking guru. Armed with a notepad full of romantic schemes that often bordered on the absurd, she concocted a plan to unite Gus and Richard in a whirlwind of comic situations. Little did she know, destiny had its own ideas. On a delightfully chaotic afternoon, a vintage steam train, the town's latest attraction, chugged into the station. Gus and Richard, at Sarah's urging, found themselves on board, trying to outquip each other with increasingly outrageous puns about the locomotive. Gus. Richard, I guess you could say this train ride is off the rails. Richard. Gus. This experience is truly trainerific. As the train pulled away, they waved to the townspeople with exaggerated enthusiasm, leaving the platform amidst laughter and applause. Meanwhile, Dr. Richard determined to make a grand romantic gesture, arrived at the station with a bouquet of roses that were almost as awkwardly arranged as his thoughts. Richard, oh, sorry. Ooh. If you're empathetic, you yawned with me. Richard surveying the bouquet. Roses are red, violets are blue. If I give these to Gus, will he laugh? Or would he say boo? As the train gained speed, Richard's intentions remained resolute. With a mix of desperation and determination, he plunged towards the departing train, his coat flapping wildly, his glasses sliding precariously down his nose. Richard grumbling, not so sure if this is romantic or just plain ridiculous. Just as Richard's fingers grazed the railing of the caboose, his coat got snagged on a hook, and he found himself dangling in a pose that even contortionists would find impressive. Richard, deadpan. Well, certainly is a new perspective on things. Meanwhile, Gus and his newfound companion, Jodi, a spirited artist with a penchant for whimsy, reveled in the train's rhythm, their laughter echoing against the backdrop of rolling hills and painted skies. Gus, Jodi, this train journey feels like a scene out of a silent film. Jodi, let's just hope it's not a comedy of errors. As they marveled at the unfolding scenery, Jodi's eyes widened as she spotted a spectacle that could only be described as comedic chaos in progress. Jodi, Gus, you won't believe your eyes. Gus turned just in time to see Richard clinging to the train, his coat tangled in a most undignified manner. Well, looks like somebody's trying to ride the crazy train. Should we help him or just enjoy the show? As the train continued on its journey with Gus and Jodi wrapped up in their own world of laughter and shared stories, the town's residents could hardly believe their luck. The theater of life had presented them with a masterpiece of comedic timing. Meanwhile, Dr. Richard Samuels found himself caught in hilarity and humiliation. His coat flapped in the wind like a flag of surrender, and his glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. Well, this certainly is a twist I didn't anticipate. As the sun cast a warm golden glow across the scene, Richard couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Sometimes, life's finest moments were the ones that unfolded in the most unexpected ways. As the train disappeared into the horizon, leaving a trail of laughter behind, the town of Willowbrook chuckled in collective delight. The tale of Gus, Richard, and the unlikely love story that sprouted amidst the comedic chaos became a cherished legend. A reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that leave us laughing and yearning for more. But amidst all the chuckles and chaos, there was another subplot that had the town buzzing with amusement. You see, Gus had become a fervent advocate of what he passionately called a, quote, multi-dimensional synergistic lifestyle enhancement program. Gus, isn't that just a fancy way of saying pyramid scheme? Pyramid scheme? No. Sarah, this is the way of the future. It's a triangle of life improvement. Gus, you do realize the definition of a pyramid, right? Sarah, my dear friend, you just don't see the big picture. It's like a puzzle. Every piece fits together perfectly to create success. As the town debated the merits of Gus's not a pyramid scheme, the laughter continued to echo through the streets of Willowbrook, painting a canvas of joy, love, and delightfully peculiar moments. Well done, ChatGPT. Well done. So let me say something about this. I did not tell ChatGPT that Jodi was a painter. They simply picked that. So yeah. Why no wig tonight? Well, it wasn't exactly like, driven in that direct. I didn't feel inspired to wig out. But maybe next time. You never know. You never know. All right. Well, let's continue on, shall we? She's so excited. She's so damn excited.
My name is Alice LaViolette.
And Miss LaViolette, what do you do for a living?
I'm a psychotherapist. I do consulting and training.
Yes, I did. And I passed it on to our marketing crew. And we're going to see what we can do with that because I'd like it to go on a sticker. And once we have a design, I will show it here. I liked what you had found. Once we have something, I'll show it here, and you're getting all the credit for that, Kelly. All of it.
And I do expert witness occasionally.
Okay. And so, psychotherapy in what?
Psychotherapy, I have a private practice.
Okay.
And I have a specialty in domestic violence. I conduct 2 groups a week for men who perpetrate domestic violence. And I have a broad-based private practice where I do marriage counseling. I also do work with individuals. I work with adults. I work with battered women. I work with adult survivors of childhood abuse. And then I do a broad-based private practice with a variety of issues.
Okay, let's talk about your education. So what I want to know is what qualifies you to do this type of work. So can we talk about your education for a second?
Yes, I went for 2 years here in Arizona at Glendale Community College. The first year at the campus that we used to call Reed Mullin Ford University because It was right next to Reed Mullin Ford. And then the actual campus was sort of the campus that's there now was built for the second year. And I went to become a teacher. I got interested in psychology and then went over to Cal State Long Beach and did my bachelor's degree in clinical psychology. About 8 years later, I went back and did my master's degree in community clinical psychology, and then sat for the licensing exam. I had to do 3,000 clinical hours that were supervised, and then I sat for the licensing exam and became licensed in the state of California.
All right, so let's talk about your undergraduate degree first.
As in
so you said you finished up at Cal State
24 hours?
Cal State Long Beach.
Long Beach.
Uh-huh.
I didn't go there. So, all right, so you finished up, is that where you get your bachelor's?
That's where I got my bachelor's.
And you were talking about becoming interested in psychology?
Yes.
Okay, and so what is your bachelor's in?
My bachelor's is in
Well, they're not
clinical
selling them
psychology and
anymore.
my master's is in community
sorry.
clinical psychology.
It was for a 5K.
What's the difference between a bachelor's and a master's degree?
About 2 years. There's,
Okay.
I completed my master's in 2 years. It can sometimes take 3, but I actually did it in about 1.5 to 2 years.
All right, and your master's, you said, is in community clinical psychology?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Community clinical psychology is a program at Cal State Long Beach that was kind of unique. You were interviewed by faculty and students who had been through the program, and you had to pass, well, actually, they had to select from the applicants 12 people who would be part of this program. And back at the time, the reason I wanted to do this program was because it was hands-on. You actually got to go out in the field and work 20 hours a week doing field work, and that's what I wanted to do.
When you say field work, what does that mean?
You could pick a practicum, a place to work that had to be approved by your department. And so at that time, I did 10 hours in a community facility, a community like neighborhood kind of facility where I was doing tutoring and registering voters and that sort of thing. And then I did 10 hours a week in the battered women's shelter, which I didn't really know anything about, and was wanting to work in some form of
It was a shirt for
impacting
a
violence
5K.
against women, since I had known people who had been raped and sexually assaulted. And so I was going to work with sexual assault. And one of my friends was volunteering at the shelter and told me that it was a very interesting place to work. It was a very new field. So I decided that I would apply there, and I volunteered there 10 hours a week.
When you volunteer when you're working on your master's and in that particular community clinical psychology, and you're volunteering at a battered women's shelter, what is it that you're doing there?
Well, you're doing a lot of different things. I worked on the hotline. I was trained to work on the hotline. So I worked on the hotline.
What's a hotline?
The hotline is a 24-hour crisis line where people can call anonymously, or they can give you their name, and they can tell you, they can talk to you about what's going on in their lives. And your job is to listen to them, sometimes make referrals, sometimes recommend that they come into the shelter, that sort of thing. And in addition to that, I did clerical kinds of work. I did fundraising for the shelter. I did what was called casual counseling with the women, which is you just sat with the women and the kids in the shelter and talked to them or ran a group. I did a self-defense class for them one time because I'd taken one self-defense class and I wasn't very good. But it was fun for the women to be up and moving around and doing physical things. So.
And can we talk timeline? When in the timeline of your life are we talking about? What year is this?
1978. 1978.
1978 is when you started with your master's?
1978 is when I started with my master's. 1980 is when I completed my master's. And I volunteered at the shelter until 1979, and then I was hired in 1979.
Okay. And when you were hired at the shelter in 1979, what were you hired to do?
I'm going to burst your bubble. These are Frenchies. if you're talking about this shirt. They're French bulldogs. They're not cats, unfortunately. But doggone it, you could find one, I bet.
I was hired to start a program for men who battered their wives. And the reason for that was that we did a little piece of research on women who had been in our shelter. The shelter opened in 1977. And we did a little piece of research to find out what happened to women after they had left the shelter, a year after they left the shelter. And of the women that we could find, over 80% had returned to the person who abused them within the first year after they left. And so our director was very farsighted, and she said, we need to start a program for the men who are in relationship to the women in our shelters so they go back, so the women and children go back to a safer place. And actually, I didn't want to do that. Nobody actually at the shelter wanted to do that, but I needed a paid position. I had 2 children and I needed a job.
Why did you ultimately take the job then? Well, let me ask you this. Why didn't you want to take the job of starting a men's group?
Because I'd worked with the women and the children, and it was really hard to see what had happened to them. And so I didn't initially want to do that, but I began to do it. I began to develop the program because I liked, program development. And then when I started the work, I really liked the work, and I stayed with it.
And when you talk about working at the shelter and starting to work on this men's group,
She's
are you also
establishing her
still going to
credibility,
school
and she's going
with your
to
master's?
Yes, I'm still going to
push the
school with my
narrative
master's.
that
All right. And to get your
Jodi
master's, are you
shows
taking classes
signs
as
of
well?
being,
I'm taking classes. I had a graduate seminar that met 3 hours a
I
week
guess,
and a supervision group that met
abused,
3. And then I
battered woman.
had taken a lot of my
Not sure what
classes
the appropriate
prior
term
to
is, but
actually getting into the program. They could count classes I'd taken between my bachelor's degree and my master's degree.
Okay. And so at the time that you're now working at the shelter and you're working on starting this men's group, is there also something that you have to do to finish up your master's?
Yes, I had to do a thesis. After I completed my classwork, I did a thesis.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
You write basically a research paper, and it's a significant research paper on a topic that your clinical supervisor approves and that is something that would be of interest. And I did mine on perpetrators of domestic violence. And it was one of the early theses on that topic, because at that time I had sort of a corner on the market. I had there were only 2 programs in Los Angeles County that actually dealt with working with folks who perpetrated violence. And so I had clients who volunteered to participate in that study.
Okay. And when you talk about clients, are you talking about the men, the perpetrators?
Yes, the men who were in my group.
Okay. And that's the group that you were that you created?
Yes.
And what was the purpose of that group?
The purpose of that group was to teach people skills and maybe help them to work on issues that would enable them to be more effective parents, to be more effective partners in their relationships. And at the time, I hadn't had much counseling experience. And so I sort of based my group on a healthy family. What would a healthy family look like? And I talked to the women at the shelter because at that time, I think there were 3 groups around the country that were doing this work. And I wrote to all of those groups and got information about what they were doing. And they were all doing work at about 6 to 12 weeks. They were doing short-term work. And I talked to the women in the shelter. And what was consistent from those women was that the men they were involved with had grown up in abusive families and needed help, that they needed to be, to have work on trauma issues. And so we created the group to deal also with some of those trauma issues.
And so this group that you created, that you worked with, was it just men who would be in this group?
Yes, in the state of California now, you have to have same-sex groups. At that time, you didn't, but we didn't have any referrals from women at that time.
And so how long did you keep working with this particular group? Well, you received your master's in 1980, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. When you receive your master's, let me back up a second. When you receive your master's, you said you have to write a thesis.
Yes.
Is that right? Do you have to do anything with that thesis?
You have to have it approved and you have to sit for orals. So you sit with a group that questions you on your thesis and has to approve your thesis and feel that it's worthy of, if it's to be published. I don't believe mine was published. I think parts of it might have been used, but I never pursued publishing my thesis. I was just happy to get through with it, actually.
All right. So once you receive your master's, that was, you said, in 1980?
Yes.
Okay. And then are you still then at the shelter working in the men's group?
I'm still at the shelter and I'm working with the men's group, but I'm also doing volunteer recruiting and training, and I'm doing all the community education for the group. So, for instance, I worked with the probation officers locally, and we set up the first 8-hour training program for probation officers on domestic violence in LA County, and then went around the state. And I worked with 2 probation officers on that. I did training for mental health. Initially, really in 1979, the only people that kind of wanted training were church groups. And I went to United Methodist Women, I remember, were one of the first groups that supported the shelter. And I would go to speak to their church women's groups. I went to speak to the Seroptimist. I went to speak to the Rotary. I went to speak to mental health agencies. So anybody actually who wanted to hear about it. And by the way, at conferences, we would have maybe 3 people in a workshop. That people really didn't want to hear too much about it then.
Well, I was going to ask you, in the late 70s when this is occurring, was domestic violence something that was wide known?
No, it wasn't. There were very few shelters. Shelters began to open in the late 70s and early 80s in the United States.
And you said you were one of 3 groups in the U.S. who had a men's group? Is that right?
There were 3 other programs that were outside groups. There was one program in Washington State that was at a veterans hospital, and they had a residential program there that Ann Ganley did.
I'm sorry, that who?
Ann Ganley.
Okay. Is that somebody who's involved in domestic violence, battered women? Or?
Yes, she's involved with battered women, but also involved in doing programs for the men.
Okay. And so when you're doing how did you feel working with these men?
I guess that I felt, I felt hesitant at first, but I quickly saw that they were in pain and that they, for some of them, really wanted to change. Some of them didn't. They just wanted to get their partners back. And so the men that I worked with who continued to stay in group because they had an option back then about staying in group, really seemed to want to change. And I was excited about that. I thought that was terrific. And I wanted to be part of that process. And by the way, I worked with a male co-facilitator. We wanted to set it up to look like, as much a family as we could. And so I thought having a male-female team would be a good way to go with that. And having that power dynamic where you see respectful interaction between a man and a woman would be good role modeling in that group. So we did a lot of that. And I worked with him for 28 years until he retired.
Your co-facilitator,
yeah.
Did any of these men you had started working with just the women in 1978, is that right?
Right.
Did any of these men ever frighten you when you started working with the perpetrators?
Objection, relevance.
Goes to her expertise, Judge.
Overall. Occasionally, I have been frightened probably 3 or 4 times in my career. If I was frightened very much, I wouldn't keep doing it. because it would be too frightening. So there were several times where I really worried. One time with a guy that was a gangbanger who was someone who I know had murdered people.
And when you talk about the 3 or 4 times, how many men have you counseled throughout your career? Ballpark.
Well, probably a couple of thousand, but I'm not sure. There maybe less than that. I've done two groups a week for 34 years, and I've had normally not more than 12 people in a group, usually somewhere between 8 and 10 people in a group. And the groups change so that it's an open-ended group and people can come in at different times during the period of doing that group.
All right. So from going from the first men's group, what kind of therapy do you do now?
I do very broad-based therapy. I've worked with couples, high conflict couples, people who need anger management. I work with adult survivors of childhood abuse. I continue to do that. I work with
I missed 2 gifts. I'm sorry. Shireen, thanks for gifting a membership. Megan, welcome to the cult. Candace, thank you for gifting a membership. Happy Bath Bar. That sounds fun. Welcome to the cult. And yes, still the Jodi trial.
battered women. I continue to do that. I've worked with a few men who have been abused as well. I continue to do the groups.
Thank you both for the gift.
And I work with adolescents. And occasionally I'm working with parents on parenting issues.
And when you're doing this work, do you work always with groups, or do you sometimes work with just an individual?
I work with individuals. I work with couples. I work with, I haven't worked with large families, but I've worked with, like I'm working with a grandmother and her granddaughter now, and who has custody of her granddaughter and that kind of thing.
All right. So after you, how long did you stay working at the shelter with the men's group?
I worked at the shelter from 1978 till 1984.
Okay. And all that time from 79 to 84, was that where you were working with the men's group?
I worked with the men's group from 79 to 84, but I also worked with the women, and I also did community education, and I also recruited volunteers and trained them.
Okay, so you were doing a myriad of things.
Yes, I was.
All right, and in 1984, what did you move to?
In 1984, the funding collapsed for the shelter, and I needed a job, and I thought that it might be a really good idea to try to start my own business, which was something I'd never actually considered in my life before. And I had 2 children, and so I needed.
Sustained.
Oh,
Did you start your own practice?
yes, I did. I started my own practice in 1984.
All right, and what kind of practice was that?
It was a psychotherapy practice, but I continued to do training. The probation department hired me for probably, I think I worked for the probation department on and off for about a decade, doing training for probation officers and people in camps for working with domestic violence.
So did you do volunteer work then along with your private practice?
Yes, I continue to do volunteer work.
All right. The volunteer work, did you actually work for the probation department, or was that volunteer work?
No, they paid me to do that.
Oh, okay.
They paid me to do training. I volunteered time talking with the probation department, but when I trained their officers, that was actually a paid position.
Okay. And what did they pay you to do? You said train their officers. Train them to do what?
Train them to identify and work with people who were arrested for domestic violence.
Okay. And and then with your volunteer work, did you do trainings with your volunteer work?
Yes, I continue to do training. I do training for shelters. I've done training for lots of people who requested it. I continue and have done training for churches. A number of churches have had issues where they've talked about domestic violence in their congregations, and they need to have some way to deal with that or to deal with anger, so I've done that. I do training. Most of the volunteer work I do now is training, although I'm on the alumni board at Cal State Long Beach, and so I do. reviewed grants for them and done a little bit. We're starting to meet with younger people and do some mentoring. I do that. I am a reviewer I'm on the editorial board of a peer reviewed journal, and I do peer reviews, and that's volunteer.
What peer review journal is that?
Journal of Child
I
Custody.
say,
Do you ever work in child
Congrats.
custody issues?
3 months.
I do. I consult usually with people when there are child custody issues. I have come in and done expert witness or consulting with child custody evaluators or with attorneys in domestic violence cases, and counseled battered women generally, and occasionally also I've worked with fathers who are going through domestic violence issues and working with them.
All right. And all this training that you do at churches and different areas, what kind of training is it? Is it all different kinds of training, or what are you training people to do?
It depends on the group. When I do training at churches, a lot of times it's to explain why battered women stay. It's to look at gender issues with domestic violence. Sometimes there are counselors out of the churches that want training on doing anger management. There's several groups, church groups, where they had a big enough congregation and they had people that wanted to be peer trained to do anger management groups. So I've done that. It really depends on the group and what they want. I've worked in almost every area of domestic violence. I did training on teen dating violence, and that was volunteer in the high schools. And I've spoken in the high schools in California, around in Long Beach and different areas, and done that as a volunteer. And that would be coming out and talking to kids about dating violence, teen dating violence, and what that looks like, and resources that they might have, and that kind of thing.
All right. And besides training, do you do speaking engagements?
Yes,
What kind of speaking engagements do you do?
I speak at conferences. I do keynote addresses. I've spoken for educational groups. I've keynoted for therapy groups. The California Association of Marriage Family Therapists, I keynoted for their conference. I've keynoted I keynote for the fatherhood. I've keynoted or done workshops at the Fatherhood Conference on a parenting curriculum that I helped develop.
What's a fatherhood conference?
The Fatherhood Conference is put on by Children's Institute International, and Herschel Swinger, who has passed away, was the founder of that conference. And it's really to encourage fathers to be the best fathers they can be, and for at-risk dads, fathers who've grown up in gangs, or fathers who have not been the best fathers, to really improve their fathering. And there are a lot of men who are very interested in that and come to those conferences.
All right. And besides that speaking engagement, have you been asked to speak outside the United States?
Yes, I've spoken in a number of countries. I've spoken in Japan, Israel, New Zealand, Ireland, Canada, and then I've done some work for the State Department of the United States, and those are video conferences. I just did one in Kathmandu, Nepal. I didn't go to Kathmandu, but I did a video conference there, in Cape Verde in Africa, and in Tel Aviv.
And these speaking engagements, what is it that you're asked to speak about, generally speaking?
I'm asked to speak about setting up domestic violence legislation, community organizing around development of battered women's shelters and programs that are more holistic, that address the entire family. For the most part, that's it. There are countries where people are just developing things, although Israel is quite sophisticated. And when I go to these countries, I sometimes speak to the governmental groups on the creation of laws, because I have done some work on legislation as well.
On the what?
On legislation.
Oh, legislation. Okay. And you said you've done work with the Department of the State?
Yes,
And for the U.S. government?
yes.
What is it that you do?
Those are the video conferences that I've done. I was asked to go to Sri Lanka and Maldives, and I was asked to go to Africa, but there was a very limited window of time and I couldn't fit it into my schedule. And so I wasn't able to actually travel. So the video conferences were set up.
So when you're speaking to these other countries, is it the U.S. government that is asking you to speak to them?
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Through the State Department and the embassies.
Okay. And how long has that been going on? Has that been going on through different presidencies?
During George Bush's presidency and Barack Obama's presidency.
All right. What about, you said you did some work with the LA County Probation Department. Have you done any further work with them?
Just in terms of talking to probation officers about clients, but I haven't done training for them. I think, I'm trying to remember the last time I keynoted the state probation conference, and that's about the last time. I also did a speaking engagement for female probation officers that had a specialized group, and I did training for that group.
A specialized group of what?
Just female probation officers.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you ever help to create any programs with the county department, the probation department?
Did I create programs?
Yeah, so like design any type of domestic violence training?
Well, yes, with, in 1980 in California, we created a diversion law, and people were diverted from the system and sent to counseling. And so that was where I worked with the diversion officer and the supervisor of the adult probation department to develop the training for officers to be able to deal with this influx of new clients on this new issue.
All right. What about awards? Have you ever received any awards in the area of domestic violence or in that area?
Yes, I've received a number of awards. I've been very fortunate. I just received an award from the shelter that I worked at just this past year. It's called a Champion of Hope Award. I've received a Lifetime Achievement Award. I've received proclamations from the county and the state. And I've received from the Seroptimist and other groups awards.
Okay. And we've been mentioning California a lot. Is that where you currently live?
I live in California. I've
Okay.
lived in California since I moved there in '67.
All right. And were you originally from Arizona? You said you went to Glendale Community College to begin with?
I moved to Arizona when I was 10. I moved from New Jersey to Arizona. I went to Sunny Slope High School, and I come back from my high school reunions and still have friends back here.
All right. But other than that, your business and everything is in California?
My business is in California, yes.
Okay. And so when you're talking about helping to develop different probation trainings and things like that, that's why we're talking about Los Angeles County?
Yes, and the state of California.
State
Yes.
of California. Okay. Do you have any published works? Have you published anything in this area?
I have a book called It Could Happen to Anyone, Why Battered Women Stay. It's coming out in its 3rd edition in April. I have articles that I've written for the journal Child Custody, I have a chapter in a book called Domestic Violence Offenders. I have,
Let me ask you, the chapter in the book called Domestic Violence Offenders, what is it that you're writing about?
it's called A View from the Trenches, and it's about, it's sort of a 25-year retrospective. I can't remember. It was 2002, I think it came out. And it was a retrospective on batters intervention programs and looking at what we currently know and what we knew and some of the things we look at to measure success in programs and some of the things we want to have happen in those programs.
Okay. And the book that you said that you wrote about why battered women stay?
Yes.
Is that what it's about?
Yeah, it's about why battered women stay.
All right. And when did you first write that? Do you remember?
The first edition was in 1993, and it became a bestseller for Sage Publications. And so they asked us to write a second edition, which we wrote in 2000. And then they asked us to write a third edition. And my co-author and I are old enough that we don't believe a fourth edition is going to happen.
All right. With regard to that particular book, how is it that you sit down to write a book like that? Is it based on research? What do you do to have that information available?
My co-author's a researcher. I was not a researcher. My co-author would bring me piles of research, basically piles of articles, and I would have to read them and write them up in a way that could be understood. And we use case studies in the book. We made the book something that we hoped that folks could read who were victims and perpetrators of domestic violence as well, but also people who are just interested. It's used as a textbook currently in a number of universities back east. I was just a couple years ago speaking in Hawaii, and somebody from a small island near Sri Lanka came up to me and said that they used the book there. So I have no idea who else using it, but we feel pretty good about it because people have liked it. And we've also, we've had attorneys who have used it in their cases.
Okay. And clearly you're here testifying. So do you do forensic work as well?
Yes, I started doing forensic work in 1984. I was asked by an attorney to explain why a battered woman would kill and why she stayed. My first trial in 1984 was a domestic violence homicide trial. And at that time, the battered woman's testimony was not considered. It really wasn't well thought of or well respected. And so I didn't testify in that case. I consulted in that case. But I know that I didn't even know that this was a job. I thought it was a volunteer position. And when she asked me to do it, I said, certainly I'd be happy to do it. And I said, I'm assuming it's a volunteer position. And she said, no, you get paid to do it. And so I was surprised.
All right. And since that time, do you know about how many cases you've worked on forensically?
I've worked on about 60 cases forensically. I don't do a lot of forensic work. I do usually about 2 cases, sometimes 3 cases in a year, depending on whether I'm consulting.
Why don't you do a lot of forensic work?
Because it's very difficult for me sometimes to watch the process.
Objection relevance.
Thank
Do you have your own practice as well?
My private practice?
Yes.
Yes, I do.
So besides coming here to testify, do you also have a private practice that you're running?
I hope so when I get back.
Okay. What types of cases, we're talking about the forensic cases that you've worked on. What types of cases have you worked on?
I've worked on homicide cases. I've worked on a stalking case, a kidnapping case. I've worked on child custody cases. Most of the cases I've done currently are child custody cases.
Let me stop you there. When you talk about child custody cases, is that a criminal case?
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's a family law case.
Okay. So
family law cases, I've done 2 civil cases, 1 federal case, 1 post-conviction case.
okay. And of the criminal law cases that you've done, about who retains you? Do you have an idea who you work for more often, the defense or the prosecution?
I've worked for the defense about 16 times, 15 times, something like that. I've worked for the prosecution about 9 times. And I've done some prosecution work that I don't even think I have on my CV, where I've just consulted with the DA's office. I've done 3 consultations for the district attorney in Los Angeles County. And I've just volunteered. I've done that. And I do volunteer mock trial for the district attorney so they can practice with an expert witness. And I do that. I've done that twice now.
So you help the prosecutors in California get experience at cross-examining an expert like yourself?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And do you have a particular criteria that you use before you'll decide to accept a case?
It's been 84 years.
It's okay.
approach. Ms. LaViolette, you are still under oath. Do you understand?
Yes, I do.
Ms. Wilmot, you may continue.
Thank you, Honor. Good morning, Ms. LaViolette.
Good morning.
I want to
All right, it's the beginning of another day, and I know that we're about 30 minutes in front of where we usually go, but I'm not gonna lie. I'm struggling. I'm on the Strugs bus. I strug to funk. I think that's what the kids say, right? But it's been a day. It's been a day, and I have to be real. I'm not about to on everybody. So day court tomorrow. Keep an eye out. I can't remember what time Brandi said. But you know what? Here's the thing. You hit the subscribe button and then there's a bell. If you hit the bell in the drop down and hit all, you'll get notified every time we go live and every time a new video comes up. It won't be specific now and again kind of stuff. So it's definitely something, hey, I should probably make myself full screen. It's definitely something that you can do. So again, yeah, right. No Riz left. No Riz left. 9:15. Perfect. Thanks, True Crime Ranch. 9:15. I believe that's EST. That's EST. Yep. 9:15 EST. And hey, if you don't know, it's Judge Newman brang the jury. He's the one that brought Brandi and I together. He's the one that created this 13th juror monster machine. So thanks. Thanks, Judge. Thank you very much. But yes. Anyways, thank you all for being here. I appreciate you. I appreciate everybody who celebrated an anniversary tonight. It's because of you all that we are able to continue doing what we do. Thank you to those of you who gifted memberships tonight as well. That helps us continue on. Oh, I'm glad you were here. I'm glad you were here. I am. And just because of that,
Stupid idiot.
that's what there you go. You get it. Yeah, he is the judge. The trial is going to be very, very difficult, but Judge Newman's awesome. Thank you again. Okay, take care of yourself, take care of your family and your friends. And, don't forget to smile. I mean, why not, right? As Pantoufle says, don't let anybody dull your sparkle and doggone it, shine on. Shine on, you crazy diamonds. Court is adjourned. I'll see you all on Wednesday, where we're going to reveal the answers to the quiz. Bye, everybody.